Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, and all the audiences on YouTube online. I am Jung, the Vice Head of HK+, National Strategies Research Project Agency for National Research Foundation of Korea at Center for International Area Studies in Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. I feel it my honor to take the role of mediator in this meaningful international conference. This conference is co-hosted by Korea Environment Institute and HK+ Research Agency. We will have a 150 minutes meeting under the title of Seeking Supra-National Cooperation for the Sustainable Development of the Korean Peninsula. We have 4 presenters and 5 discussants from 5 different countries today, and let me introduce them one by one briefly. The first presenter is Evgeny Aleksandrovich Kanaev from School of International Affairs and Higher School of Economics in Moscow, who will present under the title Asia-Pacific Business Institutions and the Korean Peninsula, the APEC Business Advisory Council and ASEAN Business Advisory Council Perspectives. Okay, and the second presenter is Peter Hayes from Nautilus Institute for Security and Sustainability. The title of Dr. Hayes' article is Mutual Assured Interdependence, Regional Grid Connection, and Microgrids. Hi. The third presenter is Dr. Wang from National Chengchi University in Taiwan. The title of Dr. Wang's article is New Dogs, Old Tricks, the Taiwan, United States, and China Relations after American presidential election. Dr. Wang? Thank you. The last presenter is Haruki Ikumi from the Japan-Korea Cultural Foundation. She'll present under the title Countermeasures for Population Decline due to low birth rates, aging, and environmental problems. 안녕하세요, 하루키 박사님. 예, 감사합니다. We have such various topics today, and I'm sure that it will give us a chance to think of the sustainable development of the Korean Peninsula and future cooperation of the global society. We have 5 discussants. I'll introduce them one by one. Yoon Jung from Hallym University of Graduate Studies. Dr. Yoon? Okay, thank you. Lee Kwang-tae from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Dr. Lee? Okay, thank you. And Rhys Jones from University of Hawaii. Dr. Jones? Okay, thank you. And Yoon Ji-hwan from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Dr. Yoon? Okay, thank you. And Myung-soo Jung from Korea Environment Institute. Dr. Myung? Thank you. Owing to the COVID-19 pandemic, unfortunately, we had no way but to have an online conference like this, but I don't think it will dampen the ideas and insights of the participants. Someday in the future, surely near in the future, I hope that we can meet in person, wherever it might be, and we can have a chance of discussing the sustainable development and global cooperation again altogether. I will give you 20 minutes to each presenter for the presentation, and the discussants can have 10 minutes. Every presenter has his or her designated discussant, but when it comes to Dr. Jones and Dr. Myung, we ask you to sum up all 4 articles so you can have more 5 minutes. I'll give you an alert when you have just 5 minutes to go, like this, 5 minutes. And when it comes to discussants, I will alert you like this, 2 minutes, okay? So let the presenters present one by one, and after all the presentations have made, the discussants can take their part. And after that, I will give 5 minutes to each presenter to answer the questions and comments of the discussants, and I will wrap up the session. So thank you, and shall we start? I give the mic to the first presenter, Dr. Kanaev. Mr. Kanaev, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much indeed. My dear colleagues, let me first install my presentation. I suppose you can see it well. Asia-Pacific business institutions and the Korean Peninsula, the perspective of APEC Business Advisory Council and ASEAN Business Advisory Council. My dear colleagues, I am going to make 3 main points. First, I am going to address the key trends of economic regionalism, just, excuse me, to grasp the specificity of the present moment, and the value added will be very simple. What to expect from the process of multilateral cooperation, which have for decades shaped the economic landscape of the Asia-Pacific region. Second, I am going to address specifically the APEC Business Advisory Council and ASEAN Business Advisory Council as economic institutions and business institutions to reveal their specificity from the value-added perspective, what has and hasn't been achieved. And finally, I am going to apply these points to the situation on the Korean Peninsula, how they influence upon the Republic.
Sorry, Dr. Kanaev. Sorry to interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt you. But 명수정 선생님, 지금 유튜브 소리가 유입되고 있으니까 그 유튜브 저기 좀 체크를 해주세요. 지금 선생님 채널에 뭐가 문제가 있는 것 같습니다. 괜찮아요? Okay, go ahead, please. Thank you. Sorry about this.
It's okay. Well, and finally, I am going to apply the results of this discussion to the Korean Peninsula from the business perspective, how to re-energize business-to-business ties of Korean companies, as at least it is seen from Russia, in the present very complicated times. Okay, well, and here, colleagues, I would say that the hardships that the Asia-Pacific economic regionalism has been encountering have been multiplied by the present-day COVID-19 pandemics. And here you see some basic points. It goes without saying that approximately since the late zeros, trade and investment liberalization has seemed to be decreasing its appeal for the Asia-Pacific actors, and the boom of free trade arrangements in the early and mid-zeros didn't bring the widely expected results, and instead it produced a spaghetti bowl after effect, and the unified regional milieu conducive to implementing a coherent economic strategy or a coherent business strategy was difficult even before the present-day coronavirus pandemic. And the logical outcome was an appeal in the Asia-Pacific economies for an alternative field of cooperation with a strong consolidating component. But unfortunately, the connectivity agenda that appeared and was driven by, for instance, ASEAN and APEC is also senseless in the present-day economic circumstances. And colleagues, you can believe me, but the Vietnamese chairmanship in ASEAN is often referred to as the lost year, since the connectivity agenda, which has become the central pillar of ASEAN economic integration, is completely missing for very easy and very logical reasons. Also, the ongoing initiatives of economic regionalism are encountering major setbacks, and the key examples are free trade area in the Asia-Pacific region, driven by APEC, and also the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which seems to have completely lost its relevance in the priorities of its partners. And under the present-day circumstances, I personally do not see any strong foundations, even with regard to the recently concluded regional economic regional comprehensive, economic partnership, since many important points are missing in this document. Also, the politicization of the Belt and Road Initiative should be mentioned separately. We all know that politics and economy go hand in hand, and China is often described as willing to supplement its economic might by political influence, and the Chinese-led security system based upon the Belt and Road Initiative potential is something that should be taken into consideration very seriously. Also, colleagues, the rise of protectionism and restrictionism, America First, etc., was evident once again before the present-day coronavirus pandemic, and the pandemic has aggravated the situation. And in the present-day circumstances, we cannot speak seriously about trade and investment liberalization, at least as far as cross-border exchanges are concerned. Well, and the politicization of economic cooperation once again was exemplified by the Huawei cases and the Sino-American trade war and technological war, and in the present day circumstances, I do not see any reasons to expect that the intensity of these contradictions will be decreasing. And of course, the after effects of the present day coronavirus matter, since many initiatives of economic regionalism will have to be seriously revised, but the legal foundation for this revision is also underdeveloped. And it was evident once again before the present day crisis, but very little has been done in order to, for example, resolve all the difficulties associated with, for example, digital trade and digital cross-border exchanges, and how to regulate, what form of regulation framework to apply is also an open-ended question. Okay, and here, colleagues, I would turn to a different point. We all know that traditionally the Asia-Pacific economic cooperation has had two main dimensions. First, regionalization and regionalism. Regionalization is about the grassroots cooperation between companies, between businesses, between enterprises, between individual entrepreneurs. And once this cooperation has matured, later on, institutions were installed just to supplement what had already existed, what had already been developed. And the regionalization was traditionally based upon a big role attached to the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. And here, I would say that both ASEAN and APEC seem to be completely irrelevant in stimulating the cross-border activity of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. And this inward focus is evident as far as these companies are concerned, and judging by the situation in ASEAN, very few of such enterprises consider the international part of their activity to be relevant or to be, I would say, survivable in the present day circumstances. Well, we have addressed the shortcomings of the digital support, and just let me add a minor point. In the present day circumstances, we cannot speak seriously about the efficiency of the trade and economic initiatives with the participation of, for example, small and medium-sized enterprises, and also including big businesses without the digital support. And taking into consideration Sino-American contradictions and taking also into consideration the legal shortcomings associated with the digital part, digital dimension of cross-border trade and investment exchanges. This is a complicated and a very challenging task to resolve, and I have serious doubts that in the present day circumstances, much energy will be directed to this specific field. Okay, and to sum everything up, let me tell you this. The large-scale geopolitical and geoeconomic initiatives like APEC and Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership seem to be useless and pointless. And here, I can say that APEC suffers from a major shortcoming, that the inclusive Asia-Pacific region based upon multidimensional and deep cooperation between China and the United States, and it has been the cornerstone of the inclusivity of the Asia-Pacific region, and it's, I would say, key strategic advantage. This inclusivity is missing, and the breakup of the inclusive Asia-Pacific region is responsible, or might be responsible, for a complete breakup of economic cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region as such. And the initiative, Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, initially was a political rather than an economic construct, and it suffered as the political rather than the economic construct. Owing to political contradictions, now the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership has lost its initial mission, and let's call a spade a spade. This is the anti-Chinese component. Well, as far as the initiative Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is concerned, I cannot say that this multilateral initiative is toothless, but nevertheless, without India, it seems also to have lost its initial potential and its initial steam. And I have many reasons to expect that China will adopt the components, the substantial components of the Belt and Road Initiative, first and foremost, from the perspective of infrastructure, including digital infrastructure, to the institutional foundation of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And we know that China initially was against this multilateral initiative, but later on China became one of its main proponents, and now China has every reason to congratulate itself, since within this multilateral economic format, China has no competitors, and China has an additional strong instrument to shape the economic landscape of the Asia-Pacific region, and later on the Eurasian continent without competitors, just on its own, according to its own preferences and its own vision. And finally, many initiatives driven by ASEAN, for instance, ASEAN Economic Community and master plans of ASEAN connectivity, require a complete rescheduling, since you see, frankly speaking, here in Moscow, we do not know when the present-day coronavirus pandemic when it subsides, what we can expect from the year 2021, and under these circumstances, both physical connectivity and people-to-people connectivity, let's say institutional institutional connectivity, these directions are then really practically oriented directions of cooperation. But how to reschedule, how to revise this vision is also a challenging task, since once again, in order to supplement these efforts with a strong digital component, at least the ASEAN countries need strong digital possibilities, and this role, this privilege to define the digital agenda of multilateral cooperation should be delegated to them by major powers. And colleagues, put me right if I am mistaken, but neither China nor the United States is willing to do it. And here, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative comes to the fore, and China is going to adopt the components of Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership to its strategic planning. Also, China's economic projections are positive, and well, I see that I have 5 minutes left. Okay, also, China's economic projections are positive, and for China, this is a welcoming development. And China has no competitors, and its presumable competitors, for instance, members of the Indo-Pacific region, lack a strong economic foundation, and this foundation includes a lack of a strong infrastructural foundation. Okay, and with the specific relevance to APEC, BAC, and ASEAN BAC, let me tell you this. They have been successful in the directions they could have been successful. They have been able to synergize both the top-down and down-top vectors of cooperation to match the interests of state and business, and this is a welcoming development. Can be attributed to these specific multilateral dialogue platforms. They have developed practically oriented lines of cooperation, and many projects supervised and driven by APEC, BAC, and ASEAN BAC are laudable and deserve high estimates. And finally, they have been able to develop both vertical and horizontal channels of cooperation with companies and with state officials. And we know that, for instance, APEC, BAC consults APEC leaders and submits reports to APEC leaders about the economic situation, about the business situation, and this can be attributed to the success of these multilateral dialogue platforms. But they also have numerous disadvantages, and without mentioning them all separately, let me say, just for the sake of brevity, that the grassroots of cooperation has traditionally been uncovered, and the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises haven't been covered by APEC, BAC, and ASEAN BAC, while they have traditionally been the drivers, the energizers of multilateral cooperation as such within, for instance, the Japanese-led Flying Geese model, or the Chinese-led model premised upon the Belt and Road Initiative. And very briefly turning to the Korean Peninsula, let me say that APEC has traditionally been a secondary instrument of Korean trade policy, and APEC turned out unable to assist, to help the Republic of Korea when it needed this assistance. And finally, the Republic of Korea is squeezed between and simultaneously torn apart by China and the United States, and the inclusive Asia-Pacific region is the vital prerequisite for Korea to remain relevant and to remain competitive. And this component is completely missing. The inclusive Asia-Pacific region doesn't exist anymore. And the Republic of Korea has participated in very few initiatives regarding APEC, and this is all the more surprising since Korea hasn't participated in, has participated in only few initiatives associated with the digital side of cooperation. And this is all the more surprising since South Korea is strong at the digital cooperation, and this signifies a low priority it attaches to APEC. Well, and to cut a long story short, in these specific circumstances, it is not institutions rather than the people-to-people dimension of economic exchanges that really matters. And taking into consideration bright prospects for Chinese economy, it might be relevant to try to match the Chinese and the Korean interpersonal business relations, the modality of Chinese and Korean interpersonal relationship. And the Chinese has the practice of guanxi, the Korean business has the practice of yonggo, and many specialists have already raised the question of synergizing these things, and they say that both China and Korea have very much in common. For example, reciprocity. For example, you should have also a good business performance and the emotional affection. These things matter, and to synergize them is a timely and a relevant exercise. And the critical question is very simple. South Korea has strong institutions. China has the scale factor. Can this be a point of convergence rather than divergence in their prospective plans? Can this difference be a point of strength rather than a point of weakness in stimulating economic cooperation around the Korean Peninsula and in the Asia-Pacific region in general? I am slightly behind the schedule, and so I apologize for this, but I have said what I wanted to say, and my final remark is very simple. Thank you very much, and I am very pleased and honored to answer your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kanaev. It was an insightful argument about the Asia-Pacific business institutions, and it was quite interesting to hear Yeongo, Korean word from you. Okay, so Dr. Kanaev finished his argument, so maybe the discussant can have some talks about this, but the next presenter is Dr. Peter Hayes from Nautilus Institute for Security and Sustainability. His title is Mutual Assured Interdependence, Regional Grid Connection, and Microgrids. Please, Dr. Hayes.
Thank you very much, Professor Jung, and thanks to Kwang Tae Lee and all the staff for facilitating participation from so far away. I'm speaking to you from northern New South Wales in Australia, where today it's 38 degrees centigrade outside my office. And I look forward very much to seeing you again soon at Hankuk University and at KEI headquarters, where we have been many times over the decades. I'm going to now share the presentation, share screen, and there we go. So my presentation is about the issue of regional grid connection, the rise of microgrids from below, and the North Korea issue. The roadmap of this paper and presentation is in 4 parts: the geopolitical dimension, the geo-ecological dimension, the geo-economic dimension, and the geo-epidemiological pandemic dimension. I hope to cover all 4 topics in 20 minutes in great brevity, but the paper is there for the reading. The first point I want to make on the geopolitics is that the way that energy was approached in the 6-party talks as part of the denuclearization process related to the whole Korean Peninsula is that a light water reactor project was adopted. You all know about it at Cato, half built, water built at Shimpo in North Korea. And this huge project, $5 billion project, was, as it was put to me by Kim Yong-sun, the head of the Korean Workers' Party International Affairs Department in 1992, it was the barrier that makes the water flow, quote unquote. This was the contradictory project that forced the United States to change its hostile policy in the North Korean view. And the threat, of course, the compellence dimension of the North Korean nuclear threat was then still a jack in the box that had not yet jumped out. And the Lightwater project was meant to bring about a change in the fundamental relationship with the United States. You all know what happened. A large hole in the ground was built at a cost of $5 billion, and the end result was acrimony, distrust, and conflict. And to some extent, this was based on the threat of mutual assured destruction, the nuclear game. But the project did delay the North Korean nuclear weapon program by about 8 years. So it did actually have a real effect. At that time, we and many others held a series of workshops in Shenzhen, Beijing, Vladivostok in North Korea itself on regional grid integration, which included the North Korean Electrotechnology Research Institute in Pyongyang, as well as counterparts from South Korea, Electrotechnology Research Institute. The North Korean entity is called North Korean Electric Power Research Institute, as well as colleagues from the Vostok grid, from the Chinese grids. We had Mongolians at one point, and certainly from Japan. And the key issue we're examining at this point was what would be the climate change, the biodiversity, and the habitat impacts of running a grid connection line from the Russian Far East, where at that point, late 90s, early 2000s, there was a seasonal surplus of hydro capacity and stored energy, which could be traded with South Korea in particular to avoid seasonal peak problems and also trade energy for cost reduction purposes over a long grid line traversing North Korea. And the big issue became, how do you connect a reactor into that grid? The only other way you could have operated the Shimpo light water reactors was with 2 AC direct lines from South Korea, making the Shimpo reactor an island of the South Korean grid in North Korea. Would have been very difficult to run that. In fact, it would have been impossible to run that grid on the North Korean grid. This is one of the meetings. This is our North Korean colleagues in the middle, some of our South Korean colleagues to the right, and our other North Korean and South Korean colleagues on the left. We're at the border between Russia, China, and North Korea in this visit. We've been meeting in Vladivostok. So we had quite detailed discussions between the parties on this grid connection, and there were various versions of it, which included an AC-DC, DC-AC converter, so some power could be siphoned off the grid into the North Korean grid, but basically that would have been a very expensive solution. The North Koreans, of course, knew all along that this was impossible to run that reactor on their own grid. In fact, the engineer who advised Kim Jong-il that it was impossible to accept any reactor larger than 400 megawatts in 1994 told us that story. And the Americans were equally knowledgeable, because, not least because we were informing them of the state of the North Korean grid. But for political reasons, they went for the LWR project because it was the barrier that made the water flow, and the United States wanted, at that point, to make the water flow. There have been various discussions since then of exporting power from the Russian Far East. It now primarily focuses on getting power from hydro stations into China rather than into South Korea. And there have been a variety of four-party talks involving China as part of the Belt and Road Initiative and a very big picture global grid strategy. But the real problem has been all along transiting the North Korean land bridge and the fact that the DPRK's participation in such grid integration is blocked by sanctions and the nuclear weapons issue. So at that time, we were primarily looking at the geo-ecological dimensions. As I said, we looked at standards, harmonizing standards, transmission corridors and their impacts on biodiversity, and the economic and commercial realities of this grid trade. This was all built around the H concept of infrastructure development in North Korea. And in a sense, it assumed that one could invest in and upgrade the North Korean grid with the existing urban industrial geographic pattern, which is completely wrong because the North Korean industrial growth and demand for power in the future will not necessarily have any bearing on this past pattern. And the grid itself is expired, it's exhausted, it needs to be rebuilt. Our estimate to rebuild this grid is about $40 billion, which is completely impossible in any political reality in the future. So there is no way you can start with the existing grid and come up with any kind of reliable electric power in North Korea. The argument about the biodiversity essentially goes back to the concept, a Korean concept, which Koreans all know. I can never say the word in Korean because it's a tongue twister, but it's the notion that there is the backbone along the mountain and ridges into different watersheds. Each of these is a separate biodiversity watershed management regime and cultural entity. But this concept actually extends into the Russian Far East, into Northeast China, and through migratory birds and fish into Japan. And so to our way of thinking, the idea of the DMZ Peace Park never made much sense unless you connect it broadly to the entire regional biodiversity corridor. Biodiversity corridors, of course, are well-used mechanisms in many parts of the world with conflicts. They are well-established, and there have been discussions under UN auspices of a regional biodiversity corridor. And so obviously you have to ensure that these kinds of strategies at the ecological level of sustainability are aligned with the energy networked approaches to integration in the region. They should not be done separately. They should be integrated horizontally. So this led us to the current discussion, which is in the geoeconomics, how best to create energy supply or electricity supply, ensure that there is great resilience at minimum cost, and what kind of reconstruction is conceivable in North Korea of the grid. And it takes note of the phenomenon, the general phenomenon of bottom-up micro-gridification of national grids and related transmission, information transparency, physical access, and data sharing requirements to achieve regional grids under these modern technological conditions of integrated grids, not the old grid integration structure, which is top-down and dominated by large generators, and the transmission exists to support those massive units. It's the other way around in a microgrid dominated world. This led us last year to Mongolia to a regional meeting hosted by our colleagues in Ulaanbaatar with 6 North Korean colleagues. I'm the tall chap in the middle under the windmill, and to my left, or looking to the right on the screen, are 6 North Korean colleagues from various electric power institutes in North Korea. We held a week-long meeting, not a one-day meeting, but a week-long meeting with these colleagues because we did intensive training with world-class experts from General Electric, from Europe, from the Swiss utility, and a bunch of other places, as well as our South Korean, Mongolian, Japanese, and Russian colleagues to discuss this microgridification phenomenon. We also had Chinese colleagues. This meeting in the past would have happened in Beijing, but under current conditions of control, that proved impossible. A year before we had met in Beijing, a year later it was impossible, and we went to Mongolia instead. And by the way, it was minus 30 degrees where we're standing at the moment. It was pretty cold. Chris Greason has written a paper for us that you can see on the global phenomenon of these grids that are micro in scale and rely on wind energy, solar energy, biomass energy, and diesel generators with local energy storage, which are locally self-sufficient, self-reliant, but do feed power into and can draw power down from the grid. There are currently nearly 700,000 mini-grids planned around the world. There is a really fantastic growth in mini-grids. And in fact, here is the World Bank's estimates of what is going to happen by the year 2030. And this is now going to accelerate because of COVID pandemic impacts on grids, which I'll come to in a moment. So you can see the massive growth in microgridification. We see it in Southern California. Our Chinese presentation was perhaps the most mind-bending because China has embraced microgrids with almost a vengeance. It's astounding what's going on in China with microgrids at so many different levels: rural, eco-cities, major city microgrids within big cities, industrial park microgrids, island microgrids, ecotourism microgrids. The paper on which this was based, incidentally, by Professor Wang, we will publish in about a month. And if you're interested, you can get great detail on what's happening in China. I did not know how far China had gone before we went to this workshop. I think everyone was pretty impressed with what was going on the microgrid front in China. These are some of the island microgrid projects that are underway in South Korea, where we had a very detailed presentation from Seoul National University, a whole smart town project. And whilst these are small scale at this point, in the big picture of the South Korean power grid, they're growing with tremendous speed and have big implications for what kind of power strategy will be implemented in North Korea in the future, given the power imbalance between the generation on the southeast coast, big reactors and big power plants are located, and the enormous concentration of demand, of load in the Seoul area, which creates a harmonic imbalance in the grid such that it's constantly on the edge of, I wouldn't say of collapse, but it's a severe management problem for any grid. And the idea you could connect this to an unstable load in North Korea is simply absurd and cannot be done. Mongolia, in turn, has a vision of being a massive exporter using long-distance transmission lines to all the parties in the region. ADB is about to complete a major study on this grid strategy. This is a commercial project. This is not some kind of fantasy in the sky, but it does, of course, require geopolitical, economic, and cross-border cooperation. This is the planning study funded by ADB at the moment. And this is the current status of cross-grid China DPRK ROC interconnection dialogues that are underway. The important thing I want to point out here is that these microgrids require a different kind of cross-border connection, communication, coordination, collaboration. You really need to be able to control the exporting of instability in your neighboring grid or from your grid to your neighbor by understanding the grid status at the microsecond level. And currently we do that by estimating the grid status using algorithms that have nonlinear variables in them, and they can be badly off almost instantly, and we can lose control of grids, and then we have blackouts, sometimes cascading blackouts. So your traditional approach is you have an energy management system in your grid, and then with your neighbors, they have the same, and you share your estimates, and you have a command center with communications to give them warning or to ask them what the hell is going on with a transmission line that seems to be unstable and is cascading that, transporting that instability into your grid. The new model is that you supplement, and this is what it would look like in the old model in North Korea if you had regional integration accelerated. The new model is you supplement the old model with PMU phasor measurement units or synchro phasors that take into account, and these are required really already to run microgrids within a national grid, and that you then share that data collected in real time across all the different connected grids. The difference is that a synchro phasor is a technology that actually measures the status of the grid, possibly hundreds of points in key parts of the both the transmission and distribution grid, and it's communicated back to data central in milliseconds, 20 to 200 times per second. So it's a real measurement. It's not an estimate of the state of the grid. And that enables you to manage some of the instability that arises with a mesh network of all these microgrids interacting with each other and with large generators in the grid and across borders. But the implication of doing it this way is that you have to share data, much more data in real time, and you have to be transparent to your neighbors. And that was a lesson that we hammered with our North Korean colleagues. They are de facto creating microgrids in North Korea. They have no alternative. And over time, they will connect those grids with each other. And then over time, that evolving, adaptive, local network in North Korea may be connected to South Korea and to China and to Russia. But in order to do that, they're going to have to be transparent. And they don't really understand that yet. This was the first time anyone had really given them a detailed insight into this. Of course, we were meeting just before the pandemic hit. And as many of you probably know, the pandemic has slowed the installation of power equipment, but particularly microgrid installations, which are very decentralized operations. It has resulted in a plunge in microgrid revenues. And in the long term, it may have both positive and negative effects that both slow and accelerate microgrids. But generally, those who've already made the shift found themselves insulated against the effects of COVID on the grid in their locale. So we actually have, in the long run, a view that the pandemic will probably accelerate even faster the curve that I showed you earlier of the uptake of microgrids as part of the general shortening of supply chains as a result of the pandemic. And especially the public health needs for stable local electricity supply in hospitals in many countries is an overriding imperative in the face of pandemics. And we believe that will be a permanent condition. And if you have some form of public health security initiative in Northeast Asia, which is really required to actually control pandemics in general and probably end this pandemic and engage North Korea on COVID, then you, by building the public health infrastructure in North Korea, that will come with microgrids. So I will conclude that this idea of microgridification is coming. It's unstoppable. The pandemic is accelerating it. It actually will accelerate with what is known as the Beisoto Giga City Corridor of increasingly continuous urban settlement, which has been much studied from the 1990s onwards and is the subject of megacity Beijing, Seoul, Tokyo mayoral level discussions. This will be a 1 billion person urban corridor by the year 2050, but this will probably be powered by decentralized mesh networks following that corridor, assuming that that corridor continues in the future. I will finish there just by saying that sustainability here has these 3 dimensions: geopolitics, geoeconomics, and geoecology. And in our view, this kind of microgrid dominated regional grid integration is the only way that you can denuclearize the Korean Peninsula with a sustainable energy solution for North Korea that also helps the other parties as you help North Korea, which we think should be a condition of any energy assistance to North Korea as part of the denuclearization strategy. It's the only way to make regional grid integration consistent with a set of biodiversity corridors, and it's certainly driven by the pure economics of energy supply, both commercial and economic. So to me, it's a perfect solution, and in the real world, it will unfold unevenly, inconsistently, and imperfectly. But I think we can see what's coming over the horizon. Thank you, and I'm sorry I went over 2 minutes and 23 seconds.
Thank you, Dr. Hayes. Well, yeah. Yeah, well, it was a nice argument. And, well, I'm not a natural scientist and I'm not an engineer. And as far as I know, Dr. Hayes is also a political scientist, but I could realize that the congealance of different disciplines is really needed. You took geopolitical things and ecological things and economic things and epidemiological things into consideration and made us think about the possible cooperation of the peninsula. So we can conclude that instead of mutual assured destruction, we need mutual assured interdependence. But we really wanted this, but the problem is that DPIK would accept our proposal. Yeah, we hope so. And anyway, so thank you for the presentation. And the next presentation is Dr. Wang from National Chengchi University of Taiwan, and his title is New Dogs, All the Tricks, the Taiwan, United States, and China Relations After American Presidential Election. Please, Dr. Wang.
Yes, can everyone see my screen? Yes? Yes, can everyone see my share screen now?
Okay.
Okay, great.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, our host, and hello, everyone. And it is my honor to be here to talk about the Taiwan, China, and United States relations. I'm really happy I followed a really interesting presentation today, because even we talk about very different topics, I think the fundamental thinking is somehow connected. So Dr. Hayes talking about the sustainable development, and he provided the idea about mutual assured interdependence. I think you will find out. My presentation is also about this interdependence in a very different way, of course. So this is my full part of my presentation. I want to talk about the Trump as an amateur outsider politician. This kind of person, this kind of leader changed international relations in East Asia, of course. And also because he's leaving the White House, we want to ask, did Trump ruin the East Asia politics, and will it be restored? So, and in order to answer this question, I want to use the closer relations as an example to show, especially through a neoliberal perspective. And I want to also answer a question about the Trump legacy. Does he change the romantic relations, the romantic triangle, we call it, between United States, China, and Taiwan? And finally, want to review, will the new president of the United States restore the balance, right? Restore the East Asia stability for the future. Okay, so before we talk about those boring stuff, let's look at the, some of you might know this TV drama is available through Netflix. You can, I heard it's become very popular in Korea and also in Taiwan. And Crash Landing to You, that's the title of the romantic TV drama. And but I want to show you the baseline of close relations and why this is relevant to Korea. And so even my paper is all about Taiwan, China, United States, but in the presentation, we'll talk about the comparison between the Taiwan, China versus the two Koreas. So you will see here, the bottom line of the two Koreas is, well, you cannot make any contact with any North Koreans, right? No matter it's about the romantic relations or any kind, you need approval from the unification minister. Otherwise, you might get a jail sentence or big fine. And in contrary, we see between Taiwan and China, even we have such a great political dialogue right now. For example, we've seen a fighter jet is go over in recent months, and especially even today, we have the news that the Chinese fighter jet is approaching the Davis line, the median line between Taiwan and China. So our fighter jet will be going on the sky and two sides become very, very close. So the situation becomes, people say, is very dangerous. But if you look at the societal level, right, the Taiwan-China relations has never been better. For example, people can marry to each other, right? So even a crash landing to you, that kind of scenario couldn't happen in Korea, but it is happening every day, every single day between Taiwan and China. So that picture is very famous TV celebrities. The girl marry a wealthy Chinese handsome guy. And that's not even a news because, well, it's so often people travel doing business and marry to each other all the time. So that's the bottom line of Taiwan-Strait Quarter relations. So even the top level, the higher politics has such a troubles, right? Two governments cannot recognize each other, and every single time they are threatening to each other of using forces. And we know this political stability, the geopolitical gridlock, and so on and so forth. But if you look at people's relations, right, things couldn't be any better. So how can we understand this situation? I think the easiest way is making this really, really easy and quick comparison between Taiwan, China, and two Koreas. You can see from this table, I make the summary of key points. Even Koreans starting their negotiation or cooperation a little earlier, but it is about starting from a very similar time period. So the 90s will be the high point of this two-side cooperations. But the patterns of these cooperations are very different. So the Taiwan-China is more relying on the bottom-up, economic-driven approach, while two Koreans have this top-down, political-driven approaches. And also you will see between two Koreas, they are very high level, very, well, in a way, successful, most institutionalized, supranational institution and cooperation and communication. For example, so far you have 4 high-level summits, right? One in 2000 and 2007, and also 3 in the 2018 so far. So that's 5 already, right? And in comparison, between Taiwan and China, there's only 1 high-level summit in 2015, before President Trump took power. And the Trump legacy on two regions are also very different, but more or less, it is more on military and high political level. So Trump promised a huge amount of arms sale to Taiwan, and also making really aggressive engagement to the denuclearization in Korean Peninsula. So if you look at the numbers, right, the real number about the people and money crossing borders in Taiwan and China and versus the Korea, you will see very obvious contraction. So that's the reason why I say the cross-strait approach is much more economical based and more societal based. You can see from Taiwan to China or China to Taiwan, there are almost 4 to 5 million people crossing every year. In comparison, North and South Korea only have about 100,000 people, and mostly from South Korea to North Korea working in the industrial region. And from the north, only 4% in the year of 2015. And you look at the economical exchanges, Taiwan has become the top 2 or top 3 foreign investor for China since 1994, I believe. And China also become the Taiwanese top trade partners since about 2000. So now it's still the top one. And in comparison, North and South Korea, their trade interdependency is so low that you can even not getting the real numbers, right? It's so, I would say less than 1% of each other's GDP. So I think this kind of situation, we cannot say, well, the cross-strait relation is not that perfect. We know that, right? Especially when we talk about unification and also the independency of Taiwanese people identities. So in comparison, we see majority of Korean people are supporting, or at least they thinking unification is good, is generally good, and 44% of people thinking North Korea is more of the friends, a collaborator. Well, it's almost similar, right? 36.1% of people thinking North Korea is a potential enemy. However, you look at the Taiwanese number, you will notice that majority of Taiwanese people thinking Taiwan is independent, right? They see themselves as only Taiwanese. Even few people, 27.5% people thinking they are both Chinese and Taiwanese. But when you ask them about do they support independence, I would say you can look in the middle section, right? 23.6% people saying, well, we love status quo, right? We want it to be forever. When another 28.7% saying, well, state of quo is fine. We want it now. We don't want to. We don't know about the future, but it's okay. So you see, combine two figures, about more than half of people, right, thinking not supporting the independence, right? Rather, they want to have some kind of status quo. So this kind of, right, the societal engagement, right, really high, really good, frequent and prosper societal engagement, collaborations, exchanges with this kind of political attitude, right? They want status quo, very different from Koreans. So from this cross-strait experience, we can summarize 3 lessons. So there is unspoken, I would say, the prosperity-driven consensus between China, United States, and Taiwan. Starting from the 1979, right, Deng Xiaoping's reform and openings. And after that, people around that time, since 1972, United States and China signed the 2 very important documents and normalized its relations. So the key point is, well, they will cut off the former relation with Taiwan and making this one China policy as the foundation of this so-called status quo. And secondly, they will begin this, many scholars call this romantic triangular relationship, right? Basically, in this relationship, both China and Taiwan are eager to competing for Americans' support. They want American market, right? They want to manufacture goods and export to the United States, and by buying American government bonds and making trade and making themselves become more prosperous. And in exchange, both Taipei and Beijing promised that they will maintain this status quo, right? This kind of war-free situation. No side will push forward to change the current situation, militarily, politically. In return, United States maintained this kind of strategic ambiguity. Strategic ambiguity is the attitude and American China policy and also Taiwan policy. It emphasized that, well, we will never say, we will holding our policy on one China, but we will never encourage Taiwan to pursue independency. But at the same time, we're not saying we will not allowing Taiwan to have the independence. So it is ambiguous. It is saying this, but not saying that. Well, but everybody knows what everybody should do, right? Let's just do trade. Let's make money. Let's make people get richer, get wealthier, and no war, no confrontation of any kind. Well, of course, the verbal confrontation, the political gesture, the propaganda warfare happening every single day. But on a surface, in the societal level, people doing trade, people doing economics, the businessmen travel across borders and family married to each other, and since this can become the foundation of the course of relations since the late 70s. Well, in this kind of situation, you can see Taiwan is kind of be sacrificed, right? So Taiwan is kind of reluctant, but consent to this consensus. So both major parties in Taiwan, the Kuomintang, insist there is a 92 consensus from the 1992 negotiation with Chinese delegates. So basically, it states that there's a one China, but both Beijing and Taipei agreed to differ on its definition. So Taiwan has our own definition about one China. When Beijing has its definition of one China, we disagree on we agree on its disagreement. And when DPP basically saying, no, we will never say one China. So it's not our policy, but we will promise to not changing the status quo, right? So basically they say, well, our constitution promised this and we will follow our constitution. Well, of course, our constitution is one China, right? It say Republic of China, right? That's our name. So basically they agree on this one China policy, but then they will never use the term one China. So that's kind of the current situation. So under Trump administration, we have the few troubles. And first, it's China since changing its foreign policy. And especially we saw the Chinese military become more aggressive, become in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait. We see many incidents and aircraft carrier sailing, a new one sailing, and doing all kinds of military exercises. So people are wondering if China stopped its peaceful rise policy, and if that is the current policy, well, the old economic-driven consensus die, right? That's people's worry. And secondly, if United States was abandoning its strategic ambiguity, so which means the Trump has promised if China attack Taiwan, the American soldier will going to help. Well, it's not the current situation. It's not the new American policy. That's people's concern. So if United States abandoned the old policy, will China also abandon its peaceful invocation project? And if that's happened, right, we are going to see war. And thirdly, well, when Trump was playing the Taiwan card, including the big arms sale to Taiwan, increasing the governmental visit level. For example, they passed the Taiwan Travel Act, and now the American higher level official can visit Taiwan more frequent. So is this new policy changing the situation, right? Especially increase the chance of Taiwanese government to pursue the independence. That's the three major concerns under Trump administration. And my quick answer to all three questions are no. So the bottom line here is, even two governments are, verbally attacking each other and provide many hostile gestures, including a military exercise we saw on the news every day. But this, the old traditional neoliberal bond is stronger than ever, stronger than we thought. So this economical interdependence really curbed the militarism on both sides. We see that even with, two sides have their very strong nationalism, right? The Chinese has its nationalism. Basically, people on the internet are calling the liberation of Taiwan, and when the Taiwanese netizen calling for independency right now, we see both sides have this rising militarized nationalism. But even with this kind of things exists, and also don't forget that, right? Between Taiwan and China, there's never a formal agreement of any kind. So there's no ceasefire. The two Korea signed the first ceasefire in 1953, right? When China and Taiwan never have this kind of formal agreement. So legally speaking, Taiwan and China are still in war, right? We never ended. So, and not to mention that we don't have this kind of supranational institution, right? Agreements, treaties, and so on and so forth between two sides. But somehow we have this really vibrant, very stable, and very strong societal and economical interdependence. And this interdependence, we see two governments are really reluctant and really try everything not to stop or disencourage this societal engagement. So I believe this foundation still exists and still very, okay, 5 minutes.
2 minutes.
So question for future, my last slides. So when we talk about a transnational, supranational institution, cooperation and communication, we think about NATO, right? We think about ASEAN, we think about APEC. So today we heard about a lot of discussion about okay, Americans maybe not so reliable. So let's build a new Asian NATO, right? To replace the American security arrangement in East Asia. We talk, so people want to know, well, Joe Biden, right, the new president, has this new China policy is more stable and more sustainable and be able to provide the support for this regional peace. And secondly, people also want to know, well, this new Biden China policy can replace, well, if it couldn't, right, we need an Asian NATO, right, to replace the traditional strategic ambiguity. And thirdly, we want to know, well, even United States become more stable, American foreign policy become more stable, but can China maintain its stability? Is Xi Jinping able to maintain its own power? Will he really stop the peaceful rise for good? Because the transparency of China is not so great, so we don't have the answer for that now. We kind of can answer the first question saying, well, since we have the new security and foreign policy team has been in place, Joe Biden has nominated most of his foreign policy personnel right now. So we see maybe the old Obama team is going back, and we are going to see this the old pivot to Asia policy is going to back to the East Asia. So probably the answer to the first one is yes, but answer to the second question will be, we don't know yet, but that could be one possibility, right? So definitely that will be need to be considered in the future. And I will say the real danger and the real uncertainty is more on the Chinese side, because we really don't know how stable and how sustainable the Chinese politics on this front, because, well, it is not so transparent, and we have very limited knowledge about, well, it's not transparent as North Korea, but still, right? Thank you. That's my presentation for today. Hope I provide the visible comparison between two Koreas and cross-strait relations, and hopefully I provide my insight about the economic and also societal interdependence between Taiwan and China, hopefully provide some information for the future discussion. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Wang. Well, the political situation of Northeast Asia is quite unstable, and Dr. Wang took the two different cases of Korea and cross-strait. By comparing these two different cases, well, he provided insights about the future of East Asia, and also we have to think of the possible influence of the United States after the presidential election. Well, we have to expect that Biden administration take the positive, well, foreign policy toward Asia, but who knows? Okay. Anyway, thank you, Dr. Wang. And 그리고 다음으로는 마지막으로 우리 한일 국제교류기금의 이란문화교류기금의 우리 하루키 야쿠미 박사님께서 Countermeasures for Population Decline Due to Low Birth Rates, Aging and Environmental Problems라는 제목으로 발표를 해주시겠습니다. 하루키 박사님 부탁드립니다. 감사합니다.
안녕하세요. 하루키 금이라고 합니다. 반갑습니다. 선생님들께서 거시적인 내용을 훌륭한 발표를 하셨는데 저는 사회학자로서 약간 좀 생활에 밀착된 미시적인 말씀을 드리게 되겠습니다. 그럼 발표를 시작하겠습니다. 유엔에 따르면 2050년을 정점으로 해서 세계 인구는 줄어들기 시작합니다. 그 후에는 두 번 다시 인구는 늘어나지 않습니다. 이미 선진국에서는 출생률이 급속도로 저하되고 있습니다. 그 중에서도 한국의 출생률이 세계에서 가장 낮다는 것은 다 알고 있는 사실이죠. 아이들은 사회의 허물입니다. 근데 앞으로 어떻게 되는가 하면 이 말 보세요. 후쿠오카에 덕시마라는 현이 있는데요. 그 시골 마을입니다. 이 한적한 마을에서는 곳곳에 호수아비가 마을에 마치 사람처럼 놓여 있습니다. 이 호수아비들과 함께 노인들이 제육회를 하고 야유회를 하고 호수아비가 다 생활을 함께 해줍니다. 왜 그렇게 되었을까요? 인구가 줄어들어서 젊은 사람들이 다 빠져나가기 때문입니다. 너무나 허전하니까 쓸쓸하니까 허수아비까지 만들어가지고 이렇게 사는 겁니다. 저는 이걸 처음으로 봤을 때 공포 영화 같다는 생각이 들었습니다. 그리고 앞으로 고령자가 많아지면 교통사고가 많아질 거라고 예측되어 있습니다. 고령자가 일으킨 운전사고는 하루에 2명씩 목숨을 빼앗아가고 있습니다. 얼마 전에도 일본에서는 젊은 엄마하고 아이가 고령자가 운전하는 사고 때문에 귀중한 목숨을 잃었습니다. 이 통계를 보면 한국의 인구의 추임이 전망을 알 수 있습니다. 앞으로 큰 변화가 한국 사회에 일어날 것으로 보입니다. 이거 보세요. 급속도로 65세 이상의 고령 인구의 비중이 높아집니다. 그리고 2020년부터는 생산 연령 인구가 급감되는 전망입니다. 현재의 3분의 2로 떨어지는 것입니다. 생산 연령의 인구가 감소되면 고령 인구가 빠른 속도로 증가하는 것을 뜻합니다. 몇 년당 부양해야 하는 노령 인구는 매우 크게 증가할 전망입니다. 흔히들이 일본에서는 고령화가 심각하다고 하는데 이거 보세요. 일본 통계입니다. 인구 비율의 추이를 보면 빠른 속도로 인구 구조가 변화됩니다. 65세 이상의 고령자의 비율은 일본은 약 30%, 한국은 현재는 15%입니다. 그런데 아직 일본에서는 한국에서는 낮습니다만은 그 후에는 일본은 상쇄하는 속도로 고령화가 진행됩니다. 고령자 비율은 세계 최고의 가 되겠습니다. 한국은 세계에서 가장 늙은 나라가 되는 것입니다. 늘어가는 한국과 일본, 인구 감소보다 더 큰 컴포는 소고령 사회가 오래된다는 것입니다. 이거 보세요. 이 인구 피라미드는 여태까지 인류가 겪어본 적이 한 번도 없는 모양입니다. 이 인구 피라미드를 보면 명백합니다. 나비처럼 지금 보이고 있는데 앞에 하프 반투형 모양으로 변합니다. 65세 이상에 증가하게 되면 의학이나 간호, 의료비, 들어가는 비용이나 부담은 각별히 무거워질 겁니다. 자, 이 배우는 현빈 이혜진이라고 합니다. 지금 일본에서는 사랑의 시작이라는 드라마가 엄청나게 인기를 끌고 있습니다. 이런 현빈이나 이혜진이라는 아름다운 배우들도 40년 후에는 이렇게 늙어가는 것입니다. 이건 일본의 경우입니다. 일본에서는 100년 사이에 인구가 반감되는데 인구 감소의 임팩트 자체는 일본적인 한국보다 크긴 합니다. 어쨌든 간에 일본이나 한국이나 단대적으로 인구가 늘어나는 전망은 거의 없습니다. 한국이 고령자 대국이 될 거라고 말씀드렸는데 물론 일본도 심각합니다. 자세히 보면 이렇게 일본은 앞으로 75세가 국민 3명 중에 1명당 75세라는 초고령자가 되는 것으로 전망되고 있습니다. 평균 연령이 한국보다 높은 것을 알고 있습니다. 총 인구에 차지하는 생산 연령 인구의 비율은 2065년이 되면 일본보다 더 낮은 45%까지 떨어질 것으로 예상되고 있습니다. 이 비율은 OECD 가명한 선진국 가운데 최저 수준입니다. 아이들 모습 보기가 힘들어지겠죠. 한국에서는 생산 노동이 가는 인구가 빠른 속도로 감소하는 인구의 절벽이 심각화될 것입니다. 출생률 감소 및 급격한 고령화에 따른 인구 감소는 한반도의 지속적인 사회 발전에 막대한 영향을 끼치는 것으로 보입니다. 한국의 총 인구가 100년 후에는 절반 이하는커녕 현재 5분의 1까지 늘어들 것으로 전망되는 통계도 있습니다. 통계 자료에는 가장 비관적으로 추계하는 저희 추계라는 방식이 있는데요. 그것을 보면 한국은 지금 현대에서 50일까지 인구가 감소되는 것으로 전망되어 있습니다. 젊은 세대의 세금 부담은 커지고 노동력은 감소하며 세금세 수입은 저하됩니다. 경제나 사회는 축소되며 지속적인 사회 발전이 어려워질 가능성이 있습니다. 한국과 일본은 이와 같이 공통된 사회 문제에 직면되고 있습니다. 한국과 일본의 미래 모습은 고령화가 극단적으로 진행한 사회입니다. 그 나라를 기다리는 미래는 국민의 3명 내지 2명 중에 1명이 고령자 대국이며 강국입니다. 어떤 투표 통계를 봐도 일본하고 한국은 나란히 초출산 고령화 선진국이 되겠습니다. 일본에 비해서 한국은 변화의 속도가 너무나 빠른 것이 특징입니다. 빨리 대비하지 않으면 지속가능한 사회가 유지하기 힘들어 보입니다. 이렇게 인구 변동이 심하게 일어나고 있는 원인은 명확합니다. 저출산입니다. 출생률이 계속 떨어지고 있습니다. 일본보다 저출산이 한국이 훨씬 심각합니다. 싱가포르나 대만도 마찬가지인데 남의 일은 아닐 겁니다. 2019년에 출생률을 보면 한국은 0.92포인트입니다. 일본은 1.36이고 한국보다는 좀 낮습니다. 이 통계는 50대가 되었을 때 아직 한 번도 결혼하지 않는 사람 비율을 나타낸 것입니다. 50세 미혼율이라는 통계입니다. 남자도 여자도 보세요. 일본보다 한국이 훨씬 그 미혼자 비율이 높아질 것으로 예측됩니다. 이게 한국이고요. 이게 한국 남자입니다. 그러고 보니 이 두 사람도 30대 후반인데 결혼하지 않았네요. 초혼 연령도 한국이 훨씬 높습니다. 결혼하고 싶지 않다고 말하는 여성도 일본에는 별로 없는데 한국에서는 아주 많다는 게 미혼율이 상승의 그 배경이라고 합니다. 2045년이 되면 한국에서는 남성의 3분의 1, 여성의 4분의 1은 배우자도 자식도 없는 혼자 사는 사람 되겠습니다. 사회복지를 진행하는 기본이기도 한 가족 모습도 급속하게 변화해 갑니다. 가족이 일단은 이렇게 절반이 됩니다. 그리고 단독 세대가 여러 개 40% 가까이 늘어납니다. 아이도 없는 부부만 사는 세대도 많아지죠. 또 혼밥, 공술, 소비 성향이 달라지니 경제 구조도 변할 수 없습니다. 지속가능한 산업, 경제 구조로 바꿔 나가야 합니다. 한국에서는 인구 감소와 고령화가 10% 같이 도래하는 것이 좀 일본보다 훨씬 문제가 심각하다고 보입니다. 단독 세대의 증가는 고령자 문제와 연결되기 때문입니다. 집에 있는 시간이 긴 고령자의 에너지 사용량은 다른 세대보다 높습니다. 고령화도 단독 세대의 증가도 이제 피할 수 없는 사회가 되기 때문에 에너지 소비량이라든가 여러 가지 문제가 발생할 것으로 보입니다. 사회 안전망 및 사회 보장 제도를 재정비를 해야 합니다. 70대 이상의 단독 세대가 많아지는데 누가 그들을 간호하나요? 누가 돌보는 건가요? 누가 부양해 주나요? 독거노인 고독사 문제는 일본에서 먼저 문제가 많이 생겼습니다만은 그 상황이 지금은 너무나 심합니다. 국민을 안전을 지키지 못하는 정부는 그 책임을 정부에게 물어야 된다고 생각합니다. 그런데 한국에서는 인구가 감소되기 시작했는데 우리는 뭐 한국가 통일되면 인구 문제는 해결할 것이라고 하는 사람이 있습니다. 바로 박근혜 그리고 문재인도 그런 발언, 문재인 대통령도 그런 발언 하셨습니다. 그런데 보니까 이거 유엔 이 자료를 보니까 북한에서도 저출산이 점점 진행하고 있습니다. 그리고 지금은 중연령이라고 하는데 국민의 평균 연령이 북한이 보시다시피 젊습니다. 일본이나 한국보다는요. 그런데 앞으로도 이렇게 북한에서는 아이들이 안 태어납니다. 지금 한국에서는 출생률이 0.92입니다만은 북한에서는 1.92입니다. 결코 높지 않습니다. 세계 평균보다 낮다는 것을 알 수 있을 겁니다. 그러면 어떻게 할까요? 한일 양국에 있어서 인구 감소를 보충하는 방법은 이민을 수용하는 길밖에 없습니다. 그러나 사람들은 이전처럼 이동하지 않게 되었습니다. 그리고 동북아시아 인구도 줄어들고 있습니다. 그래서 한계가 있다는 것을 알 수 있을 것입니다. 최근에는 한국에서 일본으로 이동하는 한국 젊은이가 점점 늘어나고 있습니다. 그것은 일본에서 취업하기 위해서입니다. 자, 그러면 어떻게 하면 될까요? 이 사진은 미국에 있는 상시티라는 고령자만 사는 노인촌입니다. 그게 미래의 이상적인 모습일까요? 어떨까요? 네, 지금 요즘 일본에서 가장 인기가 있는 걸그룹이 있는데요. 니쥬라고 합니다. 그래서 한국 프로듀서가 만든 그룹인데 일본에서 지금 압도적인 인기를 누리고 있죠. 근데 이 아가씨들은 지금 20대인데 이 아가씨들도 50년 후에는 이렇게 됩니다. KBG 84 이거 실제 있는 오키나와에 있는 할머니 그룹입니다. 할머니들이 춤도 추고 노래도 부르면서 이런 공연을 하고 있습니다. 이게 앞으로의 일본의 현실이라고 생각합니다. 네, 요즘 이것은 블랙 엘리펀트라는 그 용어를 많이 미디어에서 쓰는데요. 이제 바로 생각해 보니까 일본 상황이나 한국 상황이나 블랙 엘리펀트 상태입니다. 다 알고 있는데 모른 척하는 것이죠. 환경 문제가 마찬가지입니다. 근데 지금 이거 보세요. 집 문제 너무 심각합니다. 아무도 안 사는 집에 옛날에는 가족이 많으니까 이런 큰 집이 필요했는데 다 아이들이 떠나고 그리고 노인 부부들이 살다가 또 고노인 되고 다 사라진 그런 빈집이 일본 전국의 곳곳에 있습니다. 흰개미 문제라든가 화재 그리고 쓰레기를 불법 투기하거나 그 냄새 난다거나 뭐 지진이 일어나도 어떻게 하냐 막 그런 뭐 여러 가지 문제가 이미 발생하고 있습니다. 그런데 상속자가 누군지 모른다는 이유로 자치제에서는 반치되어 있습니다. 단독 세대, 그러니까 60세 이상의 고령자들이 혼자 사는 단독 세대가 어느 지역에 많은지 나타낸 지표입니다. 이 동경에서는 혼자 사는 노인들이 많은 것은 알겠는데 보세요. 가고시마라는 데가 있는데요. 거기는 젊은 사람들이 일자리가 없으니까 다 큰 도시로 빠져나가기 때문에 결국은 인구가 급속히 늘어들었습니다. 그리고 나이를 들어서 혼자 살다가 세상을 떠나게 되니까 이런 집들이 완전히 넘치고 있는 상태입니다. 이런 지방 도시에서는 빈집 문제가 점점 심각해지고 있습니다. 근데 한편에는 그 지방에 사는 사람들은 차를 몰고 다니는 경우가 많죠. 출근할 때 그리고 쇼핑하러 갈 때 차가 없으면 아무것도 못하는 지방이 많이 있습니다. 이 나가느라든가 토양을 하든가 그런 지역에서는 차가 없으면 생활할 수가 없습니다. 그런데 환경 문제 측면에서 생각하면 자동차 소유율이 높은 지역에서는 아주 공해가 좀 심해지고 그리고 탄소의 배출률이 많아집니다. 그런데 가족이 3사람이면 세대, 4사람이면 그래도 세대, 한 가족당 2세대씩 자동차를 보유해야만 생활할 수 있기 때문에 어떻게 할 수가 없는 것입니다. 한 명당의 에너지 소비량 속감을 하기 위해서는 자동차 이용을 줄여야 합니다. 이것은 이산화탄소 배출량이 삭감에 연결됩니다. 그러기 위해서는 이런 공경 통망 이용을 촉진해야 되는데요. 이거 빨간색은 자동차보다는 공경 교통망 이용률이 높은 지역입니다. 여기 오사카이고 이거 동경이고 대도시가 있는 지방에서는 공경 교통망, 그러니까 지하철이나 버스죠. 이용률이 높습니다. 그런데 한국을 보면 서울은 가장 큰 도시인데도 불구하고 한국에서는 자동차를 이용하는, 그러니까 출근할 때나 그럴 때 자동차 이용하는 사람들은 계절의 40%, 40대 이상의 30% 증산증이 많이 차지합니다. 자동차 이용률은 고학령자 그리고 약간 넉넉한 대저 사람들이 자동차를 많이 몰고 다닌다는 거죠. 근데 동경에서는 있을 수 없는 일입니다. 왜냐하면 출근할 때 주차장도 없고 그리고 직장 어린이집도 이용률도 거의 없는 게 그 자동차로 출근하기가 힘든 게 이유입니다. 동경에서는 차로 출근하는 사람은 10%도 안 됩니다. 이것은 자동차 보유 대수가 많을수록 탄소 배출량도 늘어난다는 것을 나타내는 것입니다. 다 연결되어 있습니다.
하루키 박사님,
한국 같은
2분
경우-
드리겠습니다. 2분 드리겠습니다. 예.
어떻게? 넘어가겠습니다. 나머지 2분이라는 말씀이신가요?
예.
예, 어떡해. 근데 차가 없으면 이렇게 너희들은 생활할 수 없으니까 이렇게 팽팽 차가 다니면서 지역을 돌아다니며 그 운전기사가 암도 확인도 하고 그 결과를 자치제에 궁금한 게 있으면 통보하는 시스템이 작동돼 있습니다. 그래서 이 말씀을 드려야 됐었는데 콤팩트시티라는 게 해결책이 되겠습니다. 도시를 팽창시키지 않고 공간적으로 압축한 형태로 개발하는 방식인데요. 도시의 중요 기능을 한 곳에 조성하는 도시 계획이기도 합니다. 대중교통수단의 이용 촉진을 자동차로 인해 발생되는 환경오염 문제를 해결하는 방법이기도 합니다. 일본에서는 2000년 이후에 지속가능한 도시의 실현을 향한 콤팩트시티 정책을 진행시켜 왔습니다. 2014년에는 도시지역을 도시기능 유도 구역과 거주 유도 구역에 나누고 구역 외에 개발 억제하는 정책을 내세웠습니다. 거주 유도 구역이란 행정 서비스가 구석구석까지 미치는 거주 공단지를 뜻하는 것입니다. 인구가 감소하며 인구 밀도가 저하되면 철도, 도로, 전기, 상하수도, 공공설비 등의 인프라를 유지하기 위한 비용이 큰 재정적인 부담이 됩니다. 사람들이 도시부에 모여서 살게 되면 대중교통이나 상하수도, 전략과 같은 공공서비스의 제공이 저렴해서 영위해집니다. 지방의 도시에서는 사람들이 산재해서 거주하는 것은 환경 문제를 악화시켜 왔습니다. 그래서 도시기능 유도 지역, 병원이 이렇게 밀집하게 하며 주택 유도 지역을 설정해서 공共교통망 형성 계획을 내세워 여러 개 밀집시키는 것입니다. 행정관리 범위를 축소하고 싶어서 이런 정책을 내세우기 시작했습니다. 일본 전국에서 시작한 지 얼마 안 되는데 지금 진행 중입니다. 도에서 개발 억제해 도시 중심부에서 거주하는 것을 촉진하는 것으로 교외의 녹지 지역 개발 억제하며 자연 보호나 녹화가 진행하게 되고 환경 문제 해결이 도움이 된다는 것입니다. 그 외에도 인구가 집중하면 해가 지진이나 그런 화재가 일어났을 때 구출도 복구도 신속히 대응할 수 있게 됩니다. 인구가 감소하면 대원 원조, 구조원이나 그런 행정 담당자도 부족하는 것이 명확합니다. 탈탄소 카본 뉴트럴을 실현하기 위해 공共교통망 정비를 활성화시키기 위해 자치제들은 이런 컴팩트시티를 진행시키고 있는데요. 인구 감소에 따라 세 수입이 늘어드는데 효율성을 추구해야만 살아남을 수 있습니다. 이동을 위해서 많은 자가용차가 필요한데 도시부로 모여서 살게 되면 자동차의 이용이 늘어듭니다. 컴팩트시티에서는 지구 환경의 건조화가 진행되는 것이죠. 지방 도시에서는 사람들이 산지에서 거주하는 것을 만든 것입니다. 공공시설을 이렇게 배치하거나 침략가를 하는 것으로 고령자 방문, 간호나 완진 등의 공적 서비스를 효율화하는 것은 행정 비용의 저하와 재정 지출의 억제에 연결됩니다. 여러 가지 지역마다 여러 가지 컴팩트시티 모델이 제시되어 있습니다. 이게 나가사키라는 데인데요. 험한 언덕길이 많습니다. 한국 드라마에 나오는 것으로 달동네에는 독거노인들이 많이 삽니다. 고개가 많아서 고령자들을 이동 수단으로 어떻게 이런 것을 개발했습니다. 65세 이상이면 공짜로 이용할 수 있습니다. 네, 컴팩트시티는 일본 전국에서 하고 있는데 일본 사람들이 가장 살고 싶어 하는 도시가 후쿠오카입니다. 후쿠오카는 아주 잘 정비되어 있는 도시인데요. 이게 하카다역인데요. 다 가깝습니다. 공항까지 가는 것도 버스로 아니면 촌철로 금방 갈 수 있습니다. 5분 내에 갈 수 있다는 것입니다. 그런데 행정이 결정지은 거주 지구밖에 못 살게 되면 선택권을 잃게 된다는 문제가 있습니다. 또한 거주 지구와 비거주 지구의 양극화가 퍼질 수도 있습니다. 개인의 입장에서 보면 거주의 자유를 택하는 건가, 거주 공장 지역에 이주할 건가 선택을 요구되는 시대가 올 것입니다. 이러한 장점과 단점을 생각하면서 지속적인 사회 발전을 위해서 실현 가능한 도시 정책이나 환경 문제를 생각하는 것이 중요하다고 생각합니다. 일본도 한국도 인구 감소는 피할 수 없습니다. 컴플렉시티는 지속 가능한 사회를 목표로 하는 동시에서 유력한 하나의 수범입니다. 환경 문제 이론 점도 또한 큽니다. 일본과 한국이 동아시아 지역에 있어서 트랜스내셔널한 협력을 할 수 있다면 무엇일까요? 두 나라 공통점은 선진국에서 가장 빨리 저출산이 진행되며 고령화한다고 하는 것입니다. 서로 정책과 아이디어를 경합하고 지원을 공유할 수 있을 겁니다. 한일 양국은 세계에 앞장서서 획기적인 해결책을 모색할 수 있을 겁니다. 고령화 사회를 진행하고 똑같이는 기술 혁신에 대해서도 양국이 협력해서 개발해 나갈 수 있을 것으로 믿습니다. 감사합니다.
감사합니다. Thank you, Dr. Haruki. Yeah. We are really worried about the current situation of low birth rate and the rapid aging society. Actually, last year, the annual birth rate of Korea was just 0.92, less than 1. So actually, we had a simulation with the assumption of annual birth rate of 1.34, and with that assumption, well, by 28th century, the Korean people will be gone forever from the earth. So this is really serious. So maybe the unification can be a solution, but living in Korean society is not so easy. Not only Korea, but also Japan, well, experienced the similar situations. So both of us have to, well, work together to fight against this serious problem. Okay, so we have various perspectives today. Well, political perspectives, ecological perspectives, economic perspectives, and also, well, social perspectives. And we have 5 discussions. And now it's 3:04 p.m., so we can have more 56 minutes. I give 10 minutes to each discussants, and when it comes to Dr. Jones and Dr. Myung, you can have more 5 minutes. So we will listen to the discussion from Dr. Yoon Jung from Hallym University of Graduate Studies. Please, Dr. Yoon.
Okay. It is my great pleasure to attend this international seminars. Thank you very much for your inviting me to the seminars. In situations where it is very difficult to gather together and hold seminars due to COVID-19 pandemic, the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies holds virtual conference with excellent online facilities. It is an outstanding university to host an international seminar in such a modern way. And it is my real pleasure to have a discussion on Professor Kanaev's paper on Asia-Pacific business institutions and the Korean Peninsula, the APEC, BAC, and the ASEAN BAC. This paper begins with the outline of key trends shaping the economic regionalisms in the Asia-Pacific regions. Second, the APEC BAC and ASEAN BAC are analyzed in detail from a business perspective. Third, the relationship between the development of these organizations and South Korea is analyzed in details as much as possible. This is a very useful paper to get acquainted with the Russian scholars' perspectives on regionalisms and regional organizations in the APR. Of course, this paper is only the opinion of Professor Kanaev, but most Russian scholars or the Russian government think that the position on this issue will be very similar to that of the Professor Kanaev. From this point of view, this paper can be regarded as the Russian views over the international, the economic regionalization, the institutions in APEC and ASEAN. In part one, Professor Kanaev analyzed the difficult situations facing the Asia-Pacific economies in the following 5 ways. The first, the trade investment liberalization's agenda seems to be decreasing. Second, the ongoing initiatives of economic regionalisms are encountering setbacks. Third, the Belt and Road Initiative may well have a dubious effect on the region. Fourth, there are growing nationalistic sentiments in the APR as manifested in the rise of the protectionisms and the restrictionism. Fifth, next 10 to 15 years, multilateral economic cooperations will be increasingly dependent upon the dynamics of political relations among actors in the regions. Over Professor Kanaev's 5 points above mentioned, some agree and some disagree. My opinions over Kanaev's part 1 are as follows. The first, economic cooperations in the Asia-Pacific region is in the phase of developing into new stages. Trade and investment liberalizations are on the surface of a decline, but we will come up with new plans for their activations in the near future as soon as possible. Economic regionalisms in the APR is also in a transitional period to develop into a new direction, such as CPTPP. The development of regionalisms and economic cooperations in the region needs to be viewed from the positive side to a certain extent. The second, regarding the nationalism and political fluctuations in the APR, they have always existed in the regions and are not particularly new. I would like to emphasize on these factors. Third, Professor Kanaev argued that the new advent of China's influence is in the offing. They will shape the future course and nature of the APR institutions. No one can deny that there is no objection to China's playing an important role. But China's role in the ASEAN back and the APEC back and other institutions in APR economic cooperation is not the only important one. There are many influential countries in the APR, such as Japan, US, and Russia, and South Korea as well. So it is not a very good way of thinking that although China will play a great role than any other countries, but China is not the only one country which can shape the future of the Asia-Pacific regional economic cooperations. Fourth, Professor Kanaev argued that to reinvigorate the APEC and CPTPP is problematic, while to make the RCEP efficiently take a long time. My point is that it is necessary not to look only negatively, more negatively than positively at the RCEP and CPTPP. I think positively that the economic cooperations body in the Asia-Pacific regions will evolve according to the times, such as through the RCEP and CPTPP, although there will be many hardships and difficulties. In part two, Professor Kanaev explained the APEC back and ASEAN back for details. By and large, I agree with the analysis and opinions for the part two. In part three, the Professor Kanaev analyzed the Korean positions on APEC back and ASEAN back. This is very valuable evaluations, especially for the Korean side. However, in some ways, I disagree with him. The first, Professor Kanaev argued that South Korea has always regarded APEC as at best secondary instrument of its trade policy. South Korea placed the emphasis upon the global rather than the APEC perspective. But my point is as follows. No one can deny that the world trade has been developed based on the GATT system, GATT, since the end of the Second World War until now. Russia has also been doing the world trade within the GATT system since the 1990s. I don't think it is the appropriate way to categorize the GATT and APEC categorically. South Korea's trade policy, therefore, is multi-layered and comprehensively considering several international organizations and bodies, such as the GATT, WTO, APEC, ASEAN, and also FTA. The South Korean government does not regard the APEC as a second-rate trade facilitation instrument. Okay. Professor Kanaev also argued that the South Korean leadership declared its relations with the ASEAN as equal to its relations with China, the US, Japan, and Russia. But I'd like to raise the question that the fact that the South Korean government promotes the new Southern policy does not clearly mean that the ASEAN is as important as the US, Japan, and the rest of the major powers surrounded by the Korean Peninsula. The South Korean government is planning to implement a policy that puts much more importance on cooperation with the ASEAN countries than ever before. Okay, let me just give just two questions to Professor Kanaev. Russia has traditionally tried to play a certain role and responsibility as a regional powerhouse in the Asia-Pacific regions. In this context, Russia has prioritized the cooperation with China against the US unilateralisms. However, if China's power exceedingly grows in the regions in the future, will Russia and China strategic partnership relations continue to develop? What do you think? In other words, how do you predict the reasons for the stop of their cooperations between Russia and China in the near future, especially in the Asia-Pacific region? And the final question is just briefly, I will ask Professor Kanaev. Please tell me what your concept or purpose of the multilateral economic cooperations in the APR, which Russian government is now pursuing. I'd like to know the Russian perspectives on how to develop the economic cooperations with the APR countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yoon. Yeah, Dr. Kanaev, you can answer a little bit later. Well, as a way of speeding up, I will let other discussants do their work. Okay, next is Dr. Lee Gwang-tae from Hankuk University Foreign Studies for Dr. Hayes. Okay, Dr. Lee, please.
First of all, I'd like to thank all of you to participate and literally to show up today, because as a member of organizational committee, I was so worried if there might be a connection problem or personal issues. So I'm really glad to see you well, safe, and healthy today and join us. I'm assigned to the presentation of Dr. Hayes' presentation. And as you all know, Dr. Hayes is one of the most distinguished scholars in the world on the issues, on the political and environmental issues of the Korean Peninsula. He has written extensively, and the list of his work include the Six-Party Talk, Non-Proliferation and Denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, Japan Nuclear Disaster, Environmental Energy Cooperation of Northeast Asian countries. As a Korean, I personally appreciate his works and efforts for promoting peaceful and sustainable ways to solve the regional conflicts. And I think today's Dr. Hayes' presentation today was a sort of summary and compilation of his year-long research with a brilliant twist, because Dr. Hayes while covering all 4 dimensions of sustainability, he gave the details, particularly about his idea of utilizing microgrids and about the post-pandemic transformation represented by geoepidemiological grids. I absolutely agree to his idea that there are grids and microgrids in Northeast Asia that can be connected so that we can achieve better security and sustainability in the region. The question is how we can engage North Korea in the business of connecting all the grids. This question is crucial because North Korea under Kim Jong-un's leadership now does not want to participate in any sorts of South-North collaboration, even in the humanitarian enterprises. In addition, even if North Korea wants to cooperate, we have a huge barrier to get over. There is the issue of sanctions. And it is very difficult for South Korean government or businesses to find ways to engage in any meaningful forms of connection with the North without violating UN and US sanctions. Given those 2 hurdles in front of us, I want to ask Dr. Hayes a couple of questions. Would you share your wisdom on how we can interest and attract North Korea without having to worry about the sanctions? The second question is about the potential changes that may come with the establishment of the new US presidency. What do you think will be the US policies toward North Korea under the Biden administration? Do you think the President-elect Joe Biden will continue so-called strategic patience approach of the Obama administration, or will he uphold the Singapore Agreement and seek to strike a deal with North Korea like Donald Trump? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. We know that Dr. Hayes is a renowned scholar, but he's not a fortune teller. Anyway, okay, so we can have the chance of hearing his opinion a little bit later. Okay, the next discussant is Dr. Jones from Hawaii University. And Dr. Jones, you can have more 5 minutes, so you can have 15 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to serve as a discussant for the KEI HK+ National Strategies Research Project Agenda Agency Joint International Conference on the topic of supranational cooperation and communication for the sustainable development of the Korean Peninsula. Thanks also to Hankuk University for hosting the event. This is an important topic, and it's an honor to be able to participate in this timely and informative event. I've visited Korea once before, and I really enjoyed my time there. And I do hope to come back in the future. I'm really sorry that it couldn't be in person this time, but hopefully next time around we can gather in person. I'm not personally an expert on the Korean Peninsula, but I am the editor-in-chief of the journal Geopolitics, and so I read many articles in the journal about the issues there and East Asia more generally. And so far already in this session, I've learned quite a bit from the different presentations on the situation and various geopolitical aspects of it. So it's been very rewarding to be part of this. The directions I received were to focus on one of the papers, but I have, of course, today just listened to the others. And Dr. Kanaev has given an excellent paper on the Asia-Pacific business institutions and the impact on the Korean Peninsula, but also focusing on the challenges for these supranational institutions like APEC and ASEAN in the era of COVID-19. And I look forward to hearing his answers to the many questions he received on his presentation. I also quite enjoyed Dr. Hayes's talk about the geopolitical, geo-ecological, geo-economical, and geo-epidemiological, which is a term I had never heard before, realities of the coming transitions that he's predicting towards a more regionalism, or the microgrids that he was talking about. In my personal discipline in geography, scholars have thought about regional aspects for generations, and so it's I think he's right to see some of the answers in the future in that area. And Dr. Haruki's talk as well explained the challenges for both Korea and Japan caused by low birth rates. Of course, it's a problem for most of Europe, Russia as well, facing a similar problem with an aging population, which puts pressure on government services and healthcare systems. And I appreciated all of the graphs and data in her presentation. I was asked to specifically focus on the paper by Dr. Wang, New Dogs, Old Tricks, the Taiwan, US, and China relations after the American presidential election. The paper provided an excellent overview of the relationship between the United States, the Republic of of China, which I'll call Taiwan in the talk today, and the People's Republic of China, which I'll call China. The paper details the history of the interactions between the three governments, and then it considers how the 2020 United States election, in which the candidate of the Democratic Party, Joe Biden, defeated the incumbent president of the Republican Party, Donald Trump, and thinks about what that might mean going forward. In the paper, Dr. Wang immediately calls out the hypocrisy of the United States position, which formally recognizes mainland China as the official Chinese government, while simultaneously selling billions of dollars of weapons to Taipei, to Taiwan. This strategic ambiguity policy, as Dr. Wang was calling it, has continued through both Democratic and Republican administrations for the last 35 to 40 years in the United States policy. So even as different administrations have publicly pronounced different agendas and approaches to China and Taiwan, with some much more aggressive towards China, with others critical of Taiwan. For example, Bill Clinton referred to the butchers of Beijing, and George W. Bush was more critical of Taiwan, calling the leaders troublemakers, who were disrupting that strategic ambiguity. In practice, the reality has meant that both parties have followed similar economic and military policies in the region by routinely approving large military sales to Taiwan, while also maintaining formal diplomatic relations with China. The latest deal with Taiwan was only agreed upon just a month ago, and the US agreed to send Harpoon coastal defense systems, missiles, and radar trucks to Taipei at a cost of $2.7 billion. So that relationship has continued. I think with the election of Joe Biden, there'll be a continuation of this. He was, of course, already the vice president for Barack Obama. And during the Obama administration, they sold billions of dollars of weapons to Taiwan and maintained that strategic ambiguity in the relationship. I think, though, that we can all expect some big changes compared to the Trump administration. And I think that's mostly in the sense of expecting more consistency and normality in the conduct of the President of the United States. I mean, I don't think we can, even though in policy terms with the China and Taiwan situation, it hasn't changed that much. I don't think we should overlook how unpredictable and frankly chaotic Donald Trump has been as the President of the United States. I mean, he's left a series of multilateral institutions from the Trans-Pacific Partnership to the Paris Climate Accords. He left the World Health Organization while this pandemic was happening. He's also threatened to pull out of NATO as well. He also communicates in a chaotic way. He tweets threats of tariffs or sanctions on different governments. As I'm sure you're all aware, you can't forget Trump's talking about love letters with Kim Jong-un. You know, it's been an outrageous 4 years for United States in a series of ways, but particularly in the conduct of the president in foreign policy. And I think that the Biden administration will be a return to a much more sober and reasonable diplomatic policy. Dr. Wang showed the pictures of some of the nominated incoming leaders of the foreign policy team for the Biden administration. And many of those figures were part of the Obama administration. And so I think it's a very reasonable expectation to think that the policies that they will pursue will look a lot like those 8 years when Obama was the president of the United States. The paper, and even more so in the presentation today, Dr. Wang gave us an interesting comparison of the different paths between the relations between North and South Korea and China and Taiwan. In some ways, the divergence has a lot to do with the changes that happened in China, brought about by Deng Xiaoping in 1979, starting to liberalize the economy. And that was happening at the same moment that Taiwan was facing serious diplomatic headwinds, as the United Nations General Assembly had voted in Resolution 2758 in 1971 to recognize mainland China as the official government of China. And then after that, of course, country after country around the world followed suit in the 1970s. Today, only 14 countries maintain full diplomatic relations with China. And these are, with Taiwan. And these are mostly smaller countries in the Americas, including Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Paraguay, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Kitts and Nevis, Belize, Santa Lucia. There are also a few islands in the Pacific that have maintained relations with Taiwan, including Tuvalu, Nauru, Palau, and the Marshall Islands, as well as Swaziland in Africa still has relations with full diplomatic relations with Taiwan. In some ways, though, the Pacific Islands that have these have maintained diplomatic relations are significant in a way, because two of those, Palau and the Marshall Islands, are essentially client states of the United States. Along with the Federated States of Micronesia, all three of those have a compact of free association with the United States, which allows the US to maintain military bases in those countries and gives free movement to the citizens of those countries back to the United States to work and live permanently. As part of that exchange, the US often dictates the foreign policy of those three countries. So it's significant that two of them have maintained relations with Taiwan and demonstrate that strategic ambiguity that we've talked about. In the decades since, though, of course, despite the frozen diplomatic relations between the two countries, between China and Taiwan, they've developed extremely strong economic ties. As Dr. Wang pointed out, Taiwan remains among the top 5 in China's trade relations, and China is Taiwan's largest trading partner, accounting for 28% of its exports. Consequently, there's a significant financial stake for both countries to maintain the status quo. And as Dr. Wang predicts in his talk, Taiwan will not press further for the desire for independent recognition, won't push it too far in order to maintain those economic ties, while mainland China will not take a more bellicose military move towards Taiwan for likely the same reasons. So in a sense, the paper makes the case that although the presidency of the United States is changing, and we've all endured 4 years of a chaotic Trump administration, the reality for the Taiwan Straits and the relationship between the two Chinas and Taiwan is likely to continue to be in a similar sort of situation where the American party really doesn't make that much of a difference in this particular situation. The status quo is important for the United States. It doesn't want a war in the Pacific, but it's also significant, I think, to many of the neighboring countries in the region that the relationship continues to be peaceful for Korea, for South Korea, for Japan, and for other countries in the region. It's important to maintain those relations with both the United States and China. And so stability between those two is of paramount importance, I think, to the entire region. So the Republic of Korea and Japan are equally engaged in perpetuating the status quo. The questions that I had for Dr. Wang was just to ask him to talk a little bit more about any possible changes he imagines from the Biden administration. The written version of the paper had obviously been put together before it was clear exactly what the election results would be. And so I hope he can speak a little bit more about what he envisions happening with the Biden administration. And particularly, if he could talk a little bit about some of the critiques of the Biden administration and the foreign policy picks. US Senator Tom Cotton called Biden's team panda huggers. That was his phrase, that will reinforce Biden's instinct to go soft on China. So do you think that Senator Cotton is right? Or do you expect that even if the public rhetoric might change, that the underlying policy might remain essentially the same over the next 4 years? So like I said at the beginning, I really enjoyed having the chance to read through this paper and to participate in this conference as a discussant, and I look forward to hearing the presenters' responses to these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Oops. Okay, thank you. We really need the geopolitical perspective nowadays, and we can have the chance of inviting the editor of famous SSCI journal, Geopolitics, and we hope that we can contribute to this journal also. Okay, and next discussant is Dr. Yoon Ji-won from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies for Dr. Haruki. Please, Dr. Yoon.
Okay, thank you for having me in this very valuable seminar. And I thank you all guys for sharing the very insightful presentations to us. And then if you are feeling okay, can I speak in Korean for Dr. Haruki's convenience, because she was presenting her research in Korean. So I think I have kind of trust in interpreters. And then I think that they will be speaking more fluently than I speaking in English. So, are you agreeing? Are you agreeing with this?
Okay, no problem. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. 예, 감사합니다, 하루키 박사님. 저 혹시 한 가지 시작하기 전에 제가 질문 드리고 싶은 게 있는데, 하루키 박사님께서는 지금 하루키 박사님 지금 한국어로 듣고 계신가요? 예, 하루키 박사님께서 혹시 전공이 어떻게 되시나요? 제가 이제 왜 이 질문을 드렸냐면 제가 이제 그 전공이 지리학이다 보니까 지금 또 닥터 리스 존스 교수님께서도 지리학 전공이시지만 이렇게 그 하루키 박사님의 발표에 대해서 배정을 받은 거에 대해서 제 최고의 어떤 그 매칭이 아니었나라는 생각이 듭니다. 이거는 이제 그 지리학과적인 지리학적인 개념들을 바탕으로 우리가 이해했을 때 좀 더 의미 있는 그런 발표 내용이었다라고 생각이 되고요. 이 부분에 대해서 그 여러 가지로 생각을 해봤는데 일본이나 우리 한국이나 공통적으로 이제 지금 겪고 있는 어떤 저출산의 문제, 이것이 어떤 부분에서 문제가 되냐면 지속 가능한 개발이라는 측면에 대해서 굉장히 좀 앞으로 향후 많은 문제를 일으킬 수 있다라고 볼 수 있는 것이죠. 일단 경제가 계속적으로 유지가 되기 위해서는 끊임없는 어떤 생산 인구 그리고 소비 인구가 유지가 돼야 되는 측면이 있는데, 이 부분에 대해서 앞으로 계속 이런 상태로 저출산이 유지가 된다면 그것은 일본이나 우리나라나 특히나 이제 북한도 마찬가지로 언급하셨듯이 공통적으로 이제 저출산의 문제를 계속적으로 겪고 있는 이런 측면에서 봤을 때 한반도의 어떤 그 지속 가능한 발전에 대해서 심각한 문제를 일으킬 수 있다라고 그렇게 생각을 합니다. 뭐 이런 문제뿐만 아니라 특히나 이제 이 저출산과 동시에 일어나고 있는 수도권으로의 과도한 인구의 집중, 그리고 인구뿐만 아니라 경제적으로나 정치적으로나 지나치게 이 수도권으로 모든 역량이 집중되고 있는 현상은 뭐 일본은 얼마만큼 이 수도권에 대한 집중이 일어나고 있는지 잘 모르겠지만 일본도 어느 정도 마찬가지로 이 동경에 대한 모든 국가의 역량이 집중되고 있는 상황이라고 저도 이해를 하고 있습니다. 이런 상황에서 각 지방들은 어떤 그런 인구가 끊임없이 유출되는 가운데 여기에 플러스 저출산의 문제까지 겹쳐져서 지방의 어떤 그런 경쟁력과 자생력이 끊임없이 하락하고 있는 이런 부분은 굉장히 어떤 그 국토의 측면에서 봤을 때, 국토 균형 발전이라는 측면에서 봤을 때 굉장한 비효율을 야기할 수 있다라고 볼 수 있을 것 같습니다. 이런 상황에서 어떤 그 하루키 박사님께서 제안하신 어떤 그런 실천들, 컴팩트 시티라는 관점은 굉장한 큰 어떤 가치 있는 그런 방향성을 우리에게 제공할 수 있다라고 생각합니다. 어떤 측면에서 이런 생각을 하냐면 일단 어떤 한 국가 혹은 한 지역의 경제가 발전하기 위해서는 그 지역의 중심이 되는 도시가 제대로 된 역할을 해줘야 된다라고 생각하거든요. 만약에 그 중심이 되는 각 지역들의 도시가 제대로 어떤 그 경제적인 역할 이런 부분들을 수행하고 있지 못하다면 그 지역의 사회, 경제, 뭐 정치적인 여러 가지 이제 발전의 문제들이 제대로 이루어지지 않는다. 그리고 그 중심지들이 제대로 그 기능을 수행하기 위해서는 좀 더 그 도시들이 콤팩트해져야 된다. 이거 왜 그러냐면 이거는 굉장히 이제 그 공간의 어떤 일상적인 삶의 개념에서 봤을 때 이 도시라는 것은 사람들이 공적인 공간 안에서 자유롭게 통행을 하고 그 일상적인 사람들의 어떤 통행 가운데에서 아이디어의 교류라든지 아니면은 여러 가지 이제 산업적인 발달의 기반이 어떤 그런 사람들의 일상적인 통행의 자유로움에서 비롯된다고 볼 수 있거든요. 근데 지금 현재의 뭐 미국의 도시, 특히나 이제 미국의 도시의 모델을 제가 생각을 해보자면 미국의 도시들은 굉장히 스파스하게 도시가 펼쳐져 있으면서 교회화라는 그 현상 가운데에서 사람들의 일상적인 삶의 패턴이 자동차 위주로 이루어지고 있는 그런 상황 가운데서 일상적인 어떤 사람들 간의 접촉 이런 부분이 굉장히 좀 부진하다라고 볼 수 있습니다. 근데 한 가지 불행한 것은 한국도 마찬가지로 자동차 위주의 어떤 그 삶의 패턴이 이루어지고 있다라는 점에서 다소 좀 불행한 흐름을 타고 있다라고 생각합니다. 일본은 어떤 식으로 지금 진행이 되고 있는지 모르겠지만 한국은 특히나 이제 이 신도시 건설 그 흐름 가운데에서 이제 아파트 위주의 건설이 이루어지면서 도시의 공간이라는 것이 하나의 어떤 전통적인 도시에서 우리가 발견할 수 있는 일상적인 통행과 그 일상적인 그 생각의 자유로움의 통행 속에서 벌어질 수 있는 어떤 아이디어의 교류, 그런 산업적인 어떤 활기 이런 것들이 점차 부진해지고 있다라고 볼 수 있거든요. 근데 이런 가운데에서 우리가 이 북한의 문제도 생각을 해보자면 만약에 우리가 이제 향후 통일이라든지 아니면은 한반도의 여러 가지 그런 뭐 화해의 무드 속에서 만약에 북한과도 여러 가지 경제 협력이 이루어진다면 어떤 식으로든 이 남한의 기업들이라든지 이런 정부라든지 이런 주체들에 의해서 북한이 개발이 될 텐데 이런 흐름 가운데서 북한의 도시들이 개발이 된다면 북한의 도시들도 그런 어떤 뭐 아파트 위주 혹은 자동차 위주의 도시 공간으로 구성이 되면서 일상적인 삶에서의 어떤 그런 활기, 일상적인 삶에서의 아이디어의 교류라든지 이런 부분이 굉장히 부진하고 그 결과 어떤 그 도시 내부에서의 어떤 자생력 이런 부분들이 굉장히 조금 우려스러운 부분이 있다라고 볼 수 있을 것 같습니다. 그래서 어떤 도시 개발의 어떤 패러다임 이런 부분들을 우리가 생각을 해보자면 향후 그 말씀하신 컴팩트 시티라는 그런 개념이 우리나라에서도 좀 많이 확산되어야 된다. 그리고 그 컴팩트 시티라는 것은 단순히 어떤 지역 거점의 개발에 대해서만 우리가 생각해 봐야 될 문제가 아니라 그런 어떤 나이 드신 분들 혹은 뭐 그 1인 가족들 이런 사람들이 어떤 도시 시설에 대해서 보다 자유롭게 접근할 수 있는 어떻게 보면은 이 도시 공간에 대한 어떤 도시 공간 내부에서의 사회적 서비스가 보다 많은 사람들에게 보편적으로 제공될 수 있도록 하는 이런 측면에서 보더라도 컴팩트 시티의 관점, 어떤 그런 아파트 혹은 자동차 위주의 그런 도시 패턴으로부터 좀 더 우리가 유연하게 생각을 하면서 어떤 전통적인 도시 공간의 어떤 일상적인 흐름의 자유로움 이런 것들을 추구해야만 우리가 향후 지역 균형 발전이라든지 혹은 북한 내부적인 지역 거점 중심 도시의 육성 이런 부분에서 굉장히 의미 있는 개념으로 작용할 수 있을 것이다라고 그렇게 생각을 합니다. 여러 가지 이제 두서없이 제가 말씀을 드렸는데 어떻게 잘 저의 뜻이 전달되었기를 바라면서 저의 토론을 마치도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you, Dr. Yoon. And he made the valuable comments about the space and the city and the development of city for preparing the possible unification of the Korean Peninsula. Okay, so last, Dr. Myung-Soo Jung from Korean Environment Institute. You can have 15 minutes and you can have discussion about the overall articles of this seminar. Please, Dr. Myung.
안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. 한국환경정책 평가연구원의 명수정입니다. 오늘 다양한 배경과 주제를 가진 네 분의 훌륭하고 또 유익한 발표 잘 들었습니다. 저는 북한의 환경 문제와 또 이런 그런 환경 문제를 이제 동북아 차원에서 조금 환경 협력을 중심으로 토론을 해보려고 합니다. 앞서서 에너지 문제에 대해서 언급을 해주셨는데 그런 에너지 문제를 생각을 할 때 그 연결되는 환경 문제가 바로 북한의 그런 민둥산 그런 그 나무가 없는 그런 민둥산 문제입니다. 이런 북한에 이렇게 산에 나무가 없는 민둥산이 발생하게 된 이유는 생산을 위한 목적도 있었지만 땔감 마련을 위해서 에너지가 없어서 이를 극복하고자 산림을 훼손하다 보니 생겨난 그런 문제입니다. 그렇기 때문에 발표 중에 언급하신 그런 에너지 협력 같은 접근이 생태계 복원에도 되게 큰 도움이 될 것이라고 생각을 합니다. 그리고 피터 헬스 박사님께서 앞으로 북한에서 일어날 개발, 특히 H형 개발에 대해서 언급을 해주셨습니다. 이제 뭐 그런 그 그리드 관련해가지고 이제 에너지 관련하는 그런 각종 이제 인프라가 앞으로 구축이 될 것이라고 전망이 되는데, 이런 에너지 인프라 외에도 그런 교통이라든지 통신망이 연결이 될 것으로 전망됩니다. 이제 북한이 개방이 되고 이렇게 이제 여건이 만들어지면, 그러면은 이런 교통망과 통신망이 이제 연결이 되면은 환경 분야 사람들의 이제 시각에서 이제 우려가 되는 것이 개발이 아주 급속하게 빠르게 일어나지 않을까. 그러면 개발이 일어나면은 환경에 부정적인 영향을 미치게 되지 않을까 하는 그런 걱정이 앞서게 됩니다. 특히 자연 생태계에 미치는 영향이 클 것이라고 생각을 하는데요. 사실 남한이 이제 그런 경험이 있는데, 워낙 개발이 빠른 속도로 일어나다 보니 이제 체계적이고 이런 이제 계획적인 개발보다는 난개발이 발생을 해서 환경에 나쁜 영향을 미쳤던 그런 선례들이 있습니다. 그래서 북한 같은 경우 이제 나중에 개발이 이제 개방돼서 개발이 될 때, 물론 북한도 그렇고 동북아 주변 국가들도 다 마찬가지겠지만 개발도 중요하고 잘 해야겠지만, 무엇보다도 지속가능한 발전을 성취하는 데 있어서는 개발과 또 환경의 보존에 대한 그런 조화를 추구하는 것이 중요하다는 점을 제가 좀 강조를 하고 싶습니다. 국토 환경 분야에서 최근 강조하는 그런 부분이 그런 개념이 생태적인 연결성입니다. 그런 이제 뭐 그리드에 대한 그런 것도 연결성이 이제 언급이 됐지만은, 생태학적인 측면에서도 생물들이 살아가는 그런 서식처 차원에서도 이런 연결성, 커넥티비티라는 것이 아주 중요합니다. 특히 이제 A라는 서식처, B라는 서식처가 있을 때 이제 경관 생태학에서는 서식처와 서식처를 이어주는 통로, 회랑, 아까 이제 코리더라는 말씀을 이제 헬스 박사님께서 말씀하셨는데, 그런 개념이 이제 실질적으로 그게 되게 중요합니다. 그래서 개발을 하면 이제 도시 개발 이런 부분들이 계속 일어날 것 같은데요. 개발을 할 때 생물들이 이동을 할 수 있는 이런 회랑들을, 그 코리더를 끊지 않도록 하는 그런 접근이 되게 중요할 것이고요. 또 이제 생물들이 서식하는 핵심 생태계가 있어요. 핵심 서식처가 있는데, 그런 데를 좀 미리 찾아서 보존과 개발을 이제 보존을 하면서도 가능한 이제 핵심 생태계는 좀 피해서 개발을 하는 그런 접근이 필요하지 않나 생각을 합니다. 그리고 아까 이제 생물 다양성과 철새에 대한 언급도 해주셨는데요. 철새라는 이런 그 야생 생물이 동북아 차원에서 아주 중요한 의미를 가집니다. 이렇게 동북아의 철새들이 이제 이동을 하는데, 특히 한반도가 이런 계절적인 이동을 할 때 쉬어가는 자리, 이런 그 장소가 되기 때문에 생물 다양성 보존에서 아주 중요한 역할을 한반도가 그렇게 하고 있고, 또 철새는 이 동북아 전체의 생물 다양성이, 사실 동북아뿐만이 아니라 철새들이 뭐 뉴질랜드, 호주까지도 이동을 하는데요. 남반부까지도 이동을 하는데, 철새들을 모니터링하면서 우리 지역의 생태계가 얼마나 잘 보존되고 있는지 그렇게 살펴보는 것도 되게 이제 필요하다고 하겠습니다. 근데 철새들이 주로 어디 사냐면은 습지에 많이 살아요. 그래서 특히 서해 지역에 그 중국과 대한민국 사이에 이 그 습지가 이런 철새들이 살아가는 서식처로서 되게 중요한 역할을 하는데, 또 우리 지역이 이 동아시아 지역이 다 쌀을 먹고 살잖아요. 쌀을 주식으로 하다 보니 논습지가 많습니다. 라이스 패디가 되게 많은데, 이런 데에서 야생 생물들, 특히 철새 같은 애들이 많이 삽니다. 그런데 개발이 일어나면 이런 습지, 특히 논습지가 아주 빨리 사라지는 경향이 있습니다. 이건 대한민국에서도 마찬가지였고 다른 국가들도 마찬가지로 알고 있습니다. 그래서 습지가 또 이런 개발에 대한 일종의 지표가 될 수가 있거든요. 그래서 습지의 가치를 알고 보존하는 그런 접근이 필요하다고 생각하고요. 생물 다양성 측면에서 어디가 이런 그 생물 다양성이 많이 사는 핫스팟이 어딘지를 좀 사전에 찾아서 그런 데를 우리는 이제 핵심 생태축이라고 부르거든요. 그런 데를 보존하는 그런 것이 필요할 것이다. 그래서 이 동아시아 지역이 앞으로 개발이 이제 더욱더 가속화될 것이라고 생각을 하는데 향후 개발에 대비해서 특히 북한에 대한 개발 협력에 대비해서 개발을 하되 보다 환경을 고려하는 친환경적인 방향으로 개발을 해야 될 것이다라는 점을 좀 강조를 하고 싶고요. 더불어서 이제 국제사회의 이런 이제 가이드라인 측면에서 좀 본다면은 이런 개발 사업을 할 때 친환경적인 개발을 유도하기 위해서 환경 영향 평가 제도라는 것이 있습니다. 근데 이제 국제사회에서는 환경 사회 세이프가드라는 그런 이제 제도가 있는데 북한에 대한 이런 개발도 이런 국제사회의 이런 그 흐름을 따라야 된다고 생각을 합니다. 특히 이제 월드뱅크 같은 경우, 그런 이제 개발은행 같은 경우, 개도국의 이제 개발 사업, 자원개발 이런 거를 할 때 각종 사회적 그런 환경적 문제가 발생을 하면서 뒤늦게 이제 그 사후 수습을 하느라 많이 힘든 그런 선례들이 있었는데 나중에 이제 북한 지역에 개발이 일어나면 많은 민간 자본도 들어갈 텐데 사전에 환경이나 사회 문제를 미리 예측을 해두지 않으면은 나중에 이제 그 사후 수습을 하면서 경제적인 타격이 아주 커질 수도 있고 환경은 환경대로 해소를 될 수가 있습니다. 그래서 미리 엄격한 환경사회 세이프가드를 만들어 놓고 이를 추진하는 게 되게 필요하다고 생각을 합니다. 근데 이제 북한의 경우는 사회주의 국가이다 보니 아무래도 이제 사회 문제보다는 환경 문제에 좀 더 초점을 낮추어 가지고 진행을 해야 되지 않을까. 그래서 좀 환경 세이프가드가 준비돼야 되지 않을까 하는 그런 생각을 해봤습니다. 그리고 인구 문제에 대한 이제 발표도 있었는데요. 사실 환경 분야에 대한 그런 환경 협력은 인구 문제 해결에도 아주 좋습니다. 북한의 이제 영유아의 사망률이 좀 다른 국가에 비해서 상당히 높은 편인데 이런 영유아 사망의 그 많은 원인 중에 한 가지가 영양 부족도 있지만 그 물과 관련된 수인성 그런 질병으로 인한 그런 원인이 되게 큽니다. 그래서 깨끗한 물을 공급하는 환경 협력은 영유아 사망률을 줄여줄 수 있고 또 공중보건의 이 수준을 끌어올릴 수 있기 때문에 인구 문제 해결에도 되게 중요하다고 생각을 하고요. 특히 이제 최근 이제 코로나가 전 세계를 강타했는데 코로나에 대한 이제 대응 방안의 하나로서 손 씻기가 있잖아요. 손을 자주 씻어서 이런 그 코로나 감염을 예방을 해야 되는데 깨끗한 물이 있어야지 손을 씻어도 효과가 있습니다. 그래서 환경 개선을 위한 이런 협력은 이런 사망률을 줄이고 이런 감염병에 대한 이런 또 확산율을 줄일 수 있어서 인구 감소 완화에도 도움이 될 거라고 생각을 합니다. 그리고 인구 뭐 사망률이라든지 이런 거와 관련해서 환경 문제를 한 가지 더 찾아보면 대기오염 문제가 있습니다. 2017년에 나온 그 WHO 보고서 세계 월드 헬스 오르가나이제이션의 보고에 의하면은 그 대기오염과 관련한 조기 사망률이 전 세계 1위로 나타났습니다. 이게 이제 배경 농도보다는 실내 대기오염이라든지 특히 이제 겨울철 좀 수준이 좀 떨어지는 대기오염이 많이 발생되는 그런 에너지 연료를 사용하기 때문이라고 추측이 되는데요. 환경 협력, 대기오염에 관련된 협력이 또 북한의 그런 조기 사망률을 줄일 수 있기 때문에도 인구 문제 해결에 도움이 된다고 생각을 합니다. 그렇지만은 대기오염 문제를 해결하기 위해서는 단순히 그 특정한 지역만의 노력으로는 되지 않습니다. 대기는 쉽게 확산이 되고 주변 지역으로 퍼져나가기 때문에 대기 환경을 개선하기 위해서는 주변 국가와의 협력이 대단히 중요하고 국제 협력이 중요함을 알아야 되는데요. 그래서 제가 좀 전에 철새에 대한 이제 말씀도 드렸는데 동북아 차원에서 이게 철새와 같은 그런 생물 다양성, 야생 생물에 대한 보존을 위한 협력도 중요하지만 또 대기질처럼 우리들의 건강과 그런 또 사망률과도 관련이 높은 이런 환경 문제에도 신경을 써야 되지 않나라는 말씀을 드리고 싶고요. 그리고 또 정리를 좀 하면 환경 분야의 협력은 사실 워낙 특수성이 있기 때문에 이게 취약계층에게 혜택이 이제 먼저 돌아가는 그런 속성도 있고 하기 때문에 그런 대북 제재 하에서도 진행할 수 있는 그런 특성이 있습니다. 그래서 특히 또 남북 관계에 있어서는 뭔가 이런 신뢰와 그런 남북 관계의 이런 그 개선에 물꼬를 틀 수 있는 그런 의미 있는 접근이 아닌가 생각을 하고요. 마지막으로 이제 더 말씀을 드리면 맨 처음 얘기가 나왔던 그런 에너지 시스템이 좀 더 지속 가능한 에너지 시스템이 되어야 될 것이며 또 생물 다양성을 보존할 수 있도록 그런 이제 핵심 생태적인 회랑을 보존하는 것이 중요하고 또 이런 것들을 위해서 주변 국가들 간의 협력이 중요하다고 생각을 합니다. 근데 협력을 하는 방법이 여러 가지가 있을 텐데 뭐 개발을 위한 투자도 사실 뭐 국가 간의 협력이 한 가지가 될 텐데 또 먼저 좀 개발이 이루어진 국가에서는 우리는 개발을 하면서 어떤 환경 문제를 직면을 했었고 그런 환경 문제를 해결하기 위해서 우리는 어떤 방식으로 접근을 했다라고 하는 경험의 공유도 대단히 중요하다고 생각을 하거든요. 그래서 뭐 오늘 이제 많은 국가가 상당히 많은 국가들이 이제 주변국이 오늘 발표와 토론을 이어나갔는데 이런 서로 경험도 공유하고 또 해법도 나눠보는 그런 자리들이 굉장히 중요하지 않은가. 또 특히 지금 이제 지속 가능한 발전을 추구하는 그런 시대에 살고 있는데 지속 가능한 발전의 중요성과 그리고 국가들 간의 협력이 정말 중요하다라는 그런 것들에 대한 좀 인식 공유를 위한 그런 노력이 필요하다고 생각을 합니다. 네, 이상입니다.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Myung. It's not easy to keep abreast with all the different opinions about the sustainable development of Korean Peninsula, even epistemic community. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the discussions and thank you for the presenters. And I will give you 3 minutes to each of you for briefly answering the questions and comments that already made from Dr. Kanaev. Dr. Kanaev, please, for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. My dear colleagues, first, I really greatly appreciate Dr. Jung's comments, and they will be respectfully taken into consideration as he has outlined new nuances which are really very valuable. Second, as far as his questions are concerned, from the Russian-Chinese perspective, let me tell you this. Russia has come to understand that to side too closely with China may be disadvantageous. Imagine the following situation. You all know that Russia and China agreed upon synergizing the Eurasian Economic Union and the Economic Belt Silk Road. Okay, India is known for its very critical attitude to the Chinese mega strategy, the Belt and Road Initiative. And in case China says, okay, we are synergizing your project and our project, can you please express your political support for the Belt and Road Initiative? And Russia will have to do it, owing to many factors, just to make China pleased, first of all, just not to possibly offend China. And let's not forget that part of the Belt and Road Initiative is the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And India is very critical about this project. India sees it as a violation of its sovereignty, and in case Russia expresses its political support for the whole Belt and Road Initiative, to say that India will be dissatisfied is to say nothing. And for this reason, Russia doesn't want to go too far to side with China, even on the Belt and Road Initiative. And concerning Russia's stance on the Asia-Pacific multilateral cooperation, well, Russia is trying to embed, to integrate its Asia-Pacific policy in the project, the Greater Eurasian Partnership. But the problem is the Greater Eurasian Partnership has numerous shortcomings from the substantial, institutional, and normative perspective. Can the Greater Eurasian Partnership be with the Korean, the Kashmir, the Afghanistan problems unresolved? Which specific institutions, if any, can be applied to institutionally connect the Eurasian space? This is very difficult, even from the Asia-Pacific perspective, not to say about the whole Eurasia. And finally, upon whose values, Chinese, if any, will this project be implemented? And until and unless these problems are not properly resolved, the Greater Eurasian Partnership is problematic at best, and to integrate the Asia-Pacific direction in the Eurasian direction of Russia's foreign policy, as Russia is planning to do it today, will be very difficult. Well, and as far as the practical side of things is concerned, Russia is elaborating on the digital regulation of cross-border exchanges, at least in the Asia-Pacific region. For example, to digitally advertise is one thing, to sell your products in the digital space is a different thing, and to establish a fully fledged digital enterprise is another absolutely different thing. And how to develop and later on to maintain really practically oriented lines of cooperation and rules of cooperation, this is what Russia is doing, or at least it is trying to do as far as the Asia-Pacific multilateral cooperation is concerned. Thank you so much. And once again, I really appreciate Dr. Jung's comments, and they all will be respectfully taken into consideration.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Kanaev. Well, I'm sorry really about this, that I cannot give you much more time. Okay, so next, Dr. Hayes, please.
Thank you. Well, I'll try and answer a number of questions in a kind of integrated or synthesized way. The first question was, how do you engage North Korea and microgrids? Well, you start by, of course, treating them like human beings and talking to them. That's what we did last year in Ulaanbaatar. And you should be aware that this meeting was done with all the relevant approvals from the State Department, the Commerce Department, and the White House. And it was complicated. But it was done at that level because, first of all, the sanctions, both unilateral and UN Security Council sanctions applied, which limited what we were able to train the North Koreans in and what we were able to give them. For example, we were not, as we have in the past, able to supply them with any specific software related to microgrid analysis and stability. Whereas in the past, under the humanitarian exemption, we were able to do that kind of training. And the software that we provided, called Long-Range Energy Alternative Planning software, was then taken to North Korea. It was translated, and I understand it's fairly widely used in North Korea today for energy planning purposes. So already the North Koreans have a fairly complete set of technical materials from that meeting to understand how microgrids will work in a regional context. And you'll see most of the papers, there are about 20 of them, are already published on our website from that meeting. We've still got a Chinese paper coming forward, as I mentioned, and the North Korean paper is also forthcoming. The next step, of course, would be study tours for the North Koreans to various parts of the world, places like Switzerland, Indonesia, Vietnam to study microgrids, to begin pilot projects on the combination of energy efficiency in households and humanitarian institutions like hospitals, clinics, childcare centers, combined with pilot microgrid projects in North Korea. We calculated for about $100 million, you could deliver enough energy efficiency household insulation material and put in a substantial microgrid, and within 6 months from zero to completion, employ about 3,000 North Koreans to produce energy efficient apartments in Pyongyang. It would be about 1/4 of the total stock could be done in less than 6 months. And in our view, once you get talks underway, you have to deliver, and you have to deliver fast, because the discount rate in North Korea, given the extreme scarcity of everything, is extremely high, and the credibility of their Western interlocutors is now extremely low. So you have to deliver real tangible benefits very quickly. How would you do it? Well, you do it on a regional basis, not a bilateral basis for the most part, so that there's no singling out of the North Koreans, no finger pointing. It has to be done in as apolitical and technical scientific a manner as possible. Under the sanctions, it's true that technology and hardware transfer will remain near impossible for years, not just quite a long time, but technical assistance and public health related infrastructure should be feasible very quickly under humanitarian exemptions, particularly if they're related to the pandemic. Now, of course, it's impossible to talk about the pandemic with North Koreans because that would reveal a weakness that they perceive probably correctly would be exploited by their adversaries as something as a small power, they'd increase their vulnerability. But public health security, rebuilding the infrastructure in a regional approach, which would focus on things such as harmonizing standards, vaccine coordination, early warning of pandemics, which particularly relates, as was referred to by one of the commentators, to the East Asian flyway, avian flu movement through the Tuman River wetlands. We badly need a scientific laboratory in the Tuman River in Northeast DPRK to monitor avian flu movement to match the labs that are in the Russian Far East, in China, in Vietnam, Indonesia, and Australia for the birdway to be not just a pathway of wonderful birds, but also to make sure it doesn't become a pandemic vector. There are many different elements to a regional public health security initiative. In that context, it would be very important for South Korea to let the United States to lead in a regional framework with direct contact with the North Koreans and not insist that inter-Korean cooperation be the lead, and to create some form of public-private partnership or consortia in which to deliver the energy assistance and the correlated public health assistance that would be needed. I just make one other comment on this matter for following up the comments from our geographer. What I perceive happening on the pandemic is what geographers, as I understand it, call the respatialization of the world system. The last time we had this scale of respatialization of affairs at every level and in every sector of human existence was the rise of European imperialism and the colonial displacements that ensued. And then after World War II, the bifurcation of the world into two spheres of influence. My sense is that's exactly what's happening with the pandemic. It's not just an accelerated, incremental speeding up of change that was already obvious. It's actually a systemic phase shift to a totally new world order, and we're barely understanding, we're barely seeing what that will look like once we come out the other side of this pandemic and notice that pandemics are going to keep on coming, and think through the full implications for humans of dealing with future pandemics. Very briefly on the question about the Biden North Korea policy, of course, I do not have any way of knowing any better than anyone else, but I think we can start with the acronym ABT, which means anything but Trump, and that will mean alliance first, and it will mean a reversion to containment. It means an increase, not a decrease in sanctions, and probably putting second priority on North Korea relative to Iran. But the Biden security team understand full well that coercive diplomacy has two blades. Obviously, it has the coercive blade of sanctions and military pressure, but like any scissors requires two blades to cut, it must have a cooperative engagement blade for any coercion to actually be successful and translated into change behavior by the North Koreans. I expect that the lead foreign policy of this administration will in fact be COVID multilateralism. That is the only way they can restore American leadership. It's also that happens to be the only way they can restore the United States. And this means that only with a US-China concert, where you combine the strongest strengths in a complementary fashion of the United States and China, can you possibly hope to deliver the vaccine to all the people who have to get it over the next 2 to 3 years in order to limit and then manage the viral reservoirs that are blocking us from opening the economy locally and on a global basis. And so if that is what happens, not just a weak reinvestment in the WHO, which cannot carry this water, it has to be a global concert of the great powers to achieve a successful pandemic response. Then it becomes possible to think of a regional public health security framework in which you could engage the North Koreans directly and indirectly. And in that sense, I think we actually have some hope that the national security team, particularly Blinken and Sullivan, are not just people who have drunk the Obama period Kool-Aid, but have their eyes wide open and will be willing to entertain new approaches, because that's what it will take for the United States to actually secure its own future, not just that of its allies and its enemies. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hayes. And I really agree with you about the sympathy for the humankind, and we need the cooperation of United States and China to cope with the pandemic problems. Okay, so next one is Dr. Wang, please briefly. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Jones, for this very comprehensive and very good summary and feedback. So a quick answer to your question, is Joe Biden a panda hugger? Yes, I guess to some degree we all panda hugger, because, well, when panda is lovely, when China is so lovely as a panda, everyone wants to hug it, right? But the issue we are facing right now is this panda is changing its external image, right? We see the wolf diplomacy, we see the sharp power, we see a lot of United Front work everywhere. So from Australia, from New Zealand, from many countries, we now very concerned about this new China image, right? The new China influence. So I guess even Biden is a panda hugger, but when more and more people are more concerned about the China influence, concerned about China's new foreign policy, then I guess the new American government has to respond to those concerns. And personally, I was thinking the North Korea issue will be very, very good test site for this new policy, because, well, look at the past, right? During Obama administration and also Trump administration, the common sense is Washington and Seoul need Beijing, right? Need Beijing's influence to engage with North Korea. But look at the past 10 years, very little progress has been made. And also we find out that Beijing's influence actually is much, much smaller than we thought, right? So in the future, I think no matter how children see China, this kind of we see China is less useful and less progressive and less collaborative patterns is emerging. And when this happens, I think with Joe Biden or whoever controls the American foreign policy has to deal with this new environment and keep dealing with the threat from North Korea, the potential financial crisis, and the Syrian refugee situation, and the pandemic, and many other issues. Right? Do we still need a cooperation from China? Well, of course, quick answer is yes, but can we rely on China for pushing all those agendas? And I think the new administration has to think those questions in a different fashion, unfortunately. So, well, that's my long question to your short, long answer to your short question. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Wang. 하루키 선생님 그리고 마지막으로 간단하게 답변해 주시면 좋겠습니다. 지금 시간이 얼마 안 남아서요. 예.
네, 감사합니다. 먼저 저는 전공이 사회학입니다. 질문 받았는데요. 동경에 그 인구가 집중돼 있죠. 근데 동경에 사는 사람들이 주변에 많이 빠져나갔습니다. 여러 가지 패턴이 있는데요. 그러니까 빠져나가고, 그러니까 주변에 사는 사람들이 많아졌다는 게 10년 좀 됐어요. 그런데 많이 돌아오기 시작했습니다. 도시 회귀 상황이 일어나고 있는 거죠. 그건 왜냐하면은 떠난 이유가 일본에서는 아파트보다는 정원이 있는 단독주택을 선호합니다. 그러다 보니까 그 가족을 형성하면서 도시 교외로 빠져나가면서 그 단독주택에 살기 위해 떠난 것인데 아이들이 동경으로 다시 이동하니까 큰 집에 노인 부부가 살기에는 너무 불편한 것입니다. 병원도 가깝지 않고 그리고 양로원에 들어가는 경우도 있기 때문에 다시 동경으로 돌아오는 사람이 굉장히 많아지고 있습니다. 그리고 또 한 가지 부터는 그 방사능 오염으로 인해 지방으로 떠나는 사람도 늘었습니다. 그 지진 이후. 그리고 지방에서 지방 인구를 늘리기 위해 지방 살리기, 지방 재생책으로 정부가 지방 이주를 촉진하기 위해 보조금을 엄청나게 많이 지급을 했습니다. 자치제요. 그런데 그것도 그 떠나는 사람들이 지방에서 생활하려고 간 가족들도 그 적응이 안 돼가지고 요즘 많이 다시 돌아오고 있습니다. 그 이유가 일본에서는 지방의 그 주민 자치 기능이 아주 오래된 역사가 있어서 커뮤니티의 결속이 되게 든든합니다. 그리고 가치관도 오래된 가치관에 그 얽매여져 있는 그런 사람들이 많기 때문에 잘 적응이 안 된 것입니다. 그래서 많은 사람들이 다시 도시로 돌아오기 시작했는데 그래서 문제가 생긴 게 코로나 때문에 이제 앞으로는 도시를 그러니까 핵심 도시를 일본 전국 곳곳에 만들어가지고 축소할 수밖에 없다. 압축할 수밖에 없다. 그렇게 모여 사는 게 답이다는 그런 방향으로 나가려고 했는데 코로나 때문에 대도시에 살기가 쉽다. 동경을 떠나고 싶다. 그래서 사회적인 거리두기를 해야 되는데 동경에 인구가 너무 많다 보니까 그게 안 되는 거예요. 그래서 지금 어떤 현상이 일어나고 있느냐면은 일본에서는 1월 달부터 2월까지 대입이 있습니다. 근데 지방에 사는 애들은 그 도시로 동경이나 오사카로 부모님들이 못 보내게, 그러니까 대학을 같이 대도시에 있는 대학에 못 보내겠다고 시험으로 못 보게 하는 것입니다. 그래서 동경에 있는 대학들은 아마 그 수험생이 많이 줄어들 겁니다. 그래서 내년에 국민들이 다 반대하는 동경올림픽 개최되는 걸로 지금으로서는 그렇게 계획돼 있는데 사람들 다 싫어하죠. 정말 올림픽이 개최되면 떠나고 싶은 마음이 저도 있습니다. 그래서 코로나 때문에 앞으로 컴팩트 시티는 어떻게 돼가는지 잘 모르겠습니다. 근데 원래는 컴팩트 시티라는 정책이 환경 문제에 대응하기 위한 대응책으로 세워졌습니다. 2012년에 법까지 제정되면서 환경 문제 해결책으로 내세운 것이었습니다. 그런데 지금 상황에서는 여러 지방에서 컴팩트 시티를 형성하기 시작했는데 잘 된 데도 있고 성공한 도시도 있고 잘 안 되는 도시도 있습니다. 그래서 왜 안 되는지 따지는 게 아마 유익한 시사점을 보여줄 수 있는 것이 될 거라고 생각합니다. 근데 모여 살 수밖에 없다는 게 고독사 문제가 아주 심각하기 때문입니다. 근데 고독사라고 하면 흔히들이 거론자들이, 그러니까 노인들이 혼자 죽어가는 걸로 상상하는데 아닙니다. 50대 남자의 고독사가 엄청나게 지금 늘고 있습니다. 그래서 아시다시피 일본은 지진이 많고 태풍도 많고 수해도 일어납니다. 그래서 그제그옹을 하기 위해서는 컴팩트하게 사람을 모여 살지 않으면 그제하지 못한다는 현실적인 문제가 있습니다. 네, 요즘 아주 충격을 가지고 있는 그 상황이 있는데요. 각 지방에서는 다리를 부수기 시작했습니다. 다리를 버스 비용이 들기 때문에 필요 없는 다리를 파괴하는 것입니다. 철거하는 거죠. 뿐만 아니라 수도관을 다시 설치 못하게 하거나 아니면 버스 공사를 하지 않거나 아니면 전기 전선을 잘라내거나 그런 식으로 그 도시를 축소하기 시작하고 있습니다. 근데 일본의 지금 현재 상황은 한국의 극미래라고 말할 수 있을 것 같습니다. 감사합니다.
예, 감사합니다. Okay, thank you, Dr. Haruki. And well, dear all the participants, well, it was a valuable time for us to share our different opinions about the sustainable development of the Korean Peninsula. We have political scientists, sociologists, ecologists, and geographer, all the different majors. So, well, we need the fortune of convergence of different disciplines. And I'd like to say special thanks to Dr. Hankuk from Korea Environment Institute, the director of Center for Environmental Information of North Korea, and Dr. Kang Junyoung, the head of National Strategies Research Project Agency of Center for International Area Studies of Hankuk University and Foreign Studies. And also I'd like to say my great gratitude to the interpreters, Dr. Lee Ju-yeon and Dr. Kim Hyun-jung, who made this international conference more valuable. And in someday in the future, without these weird accessories, we can meet in person, all together and talk about the same topic again. I hope really we can have the chance near in the future. And despite the difficult situation, you guys joined this international conference and made this conference meaningful. I really appreciate this. And just to keep connected, please, because, we'd like to have a photo time all together while you are on your screen. Okay, thank you, please. 앞으로 와서 잠깐. 여기 있으시죠? 앞으로 잠깐.